Welcome, dear listener, to a quieter story hidden beneath the great wars of the wizarding world. Tonight, we will follow the life of a man most witches and wizards barely noticed. While legends gathered around Albus Dumbledore and fear spread before the name of Lord Voldemort, Aberforth Dumbledore remained inside a dim tavern beside Hogwarts, pouring drinks, feeding goats, and watching the world from the shadows. Yet there are moments in history when the people who appear smallest become the ones darkness fears most. So settle into the silence of the night, and let us begin with the forgotten brother of the Dumbledore family. The village of Mold on the Wold rested quietly among green hills and narrow winding roads where wizarding families had lived for centuries. Stone cottages stood behind low walls covered in ivy, and in the evenings the air carried the smell of wood smoke, rain-soaked earth, and herbs growing in carefully enchanted gardens. It was the sort of place where little seemed to change from one year to the next. Children played beneath ancient trees. Owls crossed the dusk sky with silent wings. Magic existed there not as spectacle, but as part of ordinary life. In one of those cottages, the Dumbledore family raised 3 children whose lives would alter the course of wizarding history in very different ways. Albus Dumbledore, the eldest, possessed brilliance from an early age. Adults noticed it immediately. Professors later described him as a prodigy, unlike any student Hogwarts had seen for generations. Even as a child, he absorbed knowledge with frightening ease. He read constantly, questioned everything, and carried himself with a quiet confidence that often made older wizards forget how young he truly was. Aberforth Dumbledore was different in nearly every way. Where Albus observed the world carefully before speaking, Aberforth reacted instantly. Where Albus loved books and theory, Aberforth preferred fields, animals, and open air. Their father, Percival, once joked that one son had inherited the family mind, while the other had inherited its stubbornness. But those who underestimated Aberforth because he lacked Albus's brilliance misunderstood him completely. From childhood, Aberforth possessed a kind of emotional clarity, rare even among adults. He noticed things others overlooked. He understood moods, tensions, silences. While Albus disappeared into books for hours at a time, Aberforth remained deeply aware of the people around him. He could tell when his mother was tired before she admitted it. He knew when his father carried worries home from the ministry. He sensed unhappiness the way some magical creatures sensed storms approaching. It was this instinct that drew him closest to Ariana. When Ariana was born in 1885, the Dumbledore household changed completely. Albus was fascinated by her extraordinary accidental magic almost immediately. He entertained her with tiny magical tricks, making lights dance above her cradle or transforming toys into moving animals that wandered across blankets. But Aberforth approached her differently. He did not see her as extraordinary or unusual. To him, she was simply his little sister. As the children grew older, the differences between the brothers became sharper. Albus quickly became known throughout the village as gifted beyond expectation. Teachers praised him constantly. Neighbors predicted greatness. Even adults sought his opinions on magical matters, because his mind already seemed years ahead of his age. Aberforth received no such admiration. He was rougher around the edges, less polished, less interested in impressing anyone. He preferred helping injured animals behind the cottage to discussing magical theory. He disliked being compared to Albus, though those comparisons happened constantly. Sometimes visitors would smile kindly and ask if Aberforth planned to become as brilliant as his older brother someday. Aberforth usually answered with silence. There was already a distance forming, between the brothers long before tragedy entered their lives. Not hatred, not even resentment at first, but they viewed the world through entirely different eyes. Albus believed problems could be solved through understanding. If one learned enough, studied enough, thought carefully enough, solutions would eventually reveal themselves. He trusted intelligence deeply. Aberforth trusted instinct. If a person felt dangerous, Aberforth believed they probably were. If something seemed wrong, he did not need theoretical proof to justify his unease. This made him seem simple beside Albus, but simplicity and foolishness are rarely the same thing. The summer of 1891 shattered what remained of the family's peaceful life. Ariana, only 6 years old, was attacked by a group of Muggle boys after they witnessed her performing accidental magic near the family garden. Terrified by what they had seen, they attempted to force her to repeat the magic for them. When she could not, fear turned into cruelty. The attack damaged Ariana permanently. In later years, wizarding historians would discuss obscurials and unstable magical repression with academic distance. But inside the Dumbledore household, the reality was far more terrible. Ariana's magic became violent and uncontrollable. Her moods shifted unpredictably. Fear itself seemed to trigger explosions of magical energy around her. Everything changed after that. Percival Dumbledore attacked the boys responsible and was imprisoned in Azkaban. Kendra Dumbledore withdrew the family from public life to protect Ariana's condition from the wider wizarding world. The family moved to Godric's Hollow, where isolation slowly became their entire existence. Albus responded to the tragedy by turning even further toward ambition and study. Hogwarts represented escape, structure, and purpose. He threw himself into academic excellence with almost frightening intensity. Aberforth stayed close to Ariana. At first, this was simply because someone needed to remain with her. Kendra could not manage alone. Ariana's episodes became more dangerous with age, sometimes reducing entire rooms to ruins when fear overtook her. During those moments, Aberforth learned something few wizards ever truly understood. Power was frightening, not in the abstract way discussed in classrooms or ministry speeches, not as political theory or magical philosophy. He saw it directly. He saw what uncontrolled magic could do to walls, windows, bodies, and minds. He saw his mother collapse from exhaustion after nights spent calming Ariana through tears and shattered furniture. He saw how quickly love could become burden and fear. Albus understood magic intellectually. Aberforth understood its consequences. This distinction would define their entire lives. As Albus became more admired at Hogwarts, Aberforth's world grew smaller. He spent increasing amounts of time inside the isolated house in Godric's Hollow, helping Kendra contain Ariana's condition. His own magical education suffered badly because of it. While Albus discussed advanced transfiguration with professors and corresponded with brilliant scholars, Aberforth learned practical survival. How to calm Ariana during an outburst. How to rebuild broken rooms quickly before neighbors noticed. How to recognize the warning signs before magic exploded violently around the house. He became resilient in ways Hogwarts never taught. By the time he reached adolescence, Aberforth had developed a deep suspicion toward powerful people and grand ambitions. Brilliant wizards spoke constantly about changing the world, but Aberforth rarely saw them helping the people directly in front of them. Greatness often seemed to demand sacrifice from others. His father sacrificed freedom. His mother sacrificed her health. Ariana sacrificed her future. And increasingly, Albus seemed willing to sacrifice ordinary life itself in pursuit of something larger and more important. Aberforth noticed this long before anyone else did. In later years, many people misunderstood the younger Dumbledore brother because they viewed him through Albus's enormous shadow. They saw a bitter innkeeper beside a legendary wizard, a rough and abrasive man standing beside history's greatest headmaster. But shadows can distort perspective. What looked like bitterness was often exhaustion. What looked like stubbornness was sometimes moral certainty. And what looked like insignificance concealed a kind of quiet strength that men like Voldemort rarely understood until it was too late. Because Voldemort admired brilliance. He admired magical power, intelligence, blood purity, domination, fear. He understood ambition because ambition consumed his own life completely. But Aberforth Dumbledore belonged to a category of person Voldemort could never fully comprehend. A man who had already lost nearly everything. A man unimpressed by power. A man who valued protection more than glory. And perhaps most dangerous of all, a man who no longer feared disappointment, isolation, or suffering because he had lived beside them since childhood. Long before Voldemort ever rose to power, Aberforth Dumbledore had already survived the collapse of a family, the destruction of innocence, and the slow, crushing weight of responsibility. Darkness did not arrive suddenly in his life. It settled there gradually over many years, becoming familiar. That familiarity made him dangerous in ways no prophecy could measure. The house in Godric's Hollow stood at the edge of the village behind high hedges and layered protective charms that hummed softly through the walls at night. From the outside, it appeared merely old and secluded, another weathered cottage among many in the historic village. Few neighbors understood what truly existed inside it. Fewer still understood how completely grief had reshaped the family living there. For Aberforth Dumbledore, childhood ended the day Ariana was attacked. Everything afterward became divided into before and after. Before the laughter disappeared from the house. Before his father vanished into Azkaban. Before his mother's face grew pale with constant exhaustion. Before every room carried the possibility of danger. Ariana herself changed in ways both sudden and painfully gradual. At first, there were moments when she still seemed like the girl she had once been. She would smile faintly at simple toys, or listen quietly while Aberforth described animals he had seen near the village. Sometimes she sat beside the window, watching birds move across the hills, her expression distant but peaceful. During those brief periods, Kendra allowed herself cautious hope that recovery might still be possible. Then the episodes would return. The house would tremble without warning. Candles exploded against walls. Glass shattered in sudden bursts. Furniture twisted unnaturally as uncontrolled magic erupted from Ariana like pressure escaping a cracked vessel. Aberforth learned quickly that fear only worsened things. If Ariana sensed panic around her, the magic intensified. Her own terror fed the instability, consuming her from within. Kendra tried every calming spell she knew. Albus researched obscure magical conditions between his Hogwarts studies, but Aberforth relied on something simpler: presence. He stayed beside her when others backed away. He spoke calmly during outbursts instead of shouting. He treated Ariana like a frightened person rather than a dangerous object. Slowly, she began responding to him more than anyone else in the family. Even Kendra noticed it. "You steady her," she whispered once late at night, after a particularly violent episode left scorch marks across the ceiling. "I do not know why, but you do." Aberforth did not understand it either. He only knew Ariana looked less afraid when he entered the room. Perhaps it was because he never stared at her with pity. Albus loved Ariana deeply, but there were moments when his sorrow became visible in his face before he could hide it. He looked at her and saw the terrible injustice of what she might have become. Kendra looked at her and saw endless responsibility pressing down like stone. Aberforth simply saw his sister. As the years passed, this difference became more important than anyone realized. The magical world often celebrated intelligence above all else. Hogwarts rewarded brilliance. Ministries promoted ambitious minds. Great wizards were remembered for discoveries, inventions, and power. But inside the Dumbledore house, none of those things mattered very much. What mattered was whether Ariana could sleep peacefully through the night. What mattered was whether her next outburst might kill someone accidentally. What mattered was enduring another day without the family collapsing completely. Aberforth became deeply familiar with fear during those years, but not the kind Voldemort later inspired across Britain. Not political fear or fear of conquest. His fear was smaller and more intimate. The sound of breaking glass downstairs, a sudden scream in the middle of the night, his mother's exhausted breathing after hours spent containing magical explosions. Fear became ordinary. That was the first thing Voldemort would never have understood about Aberforth Dumbledore. Dark wizards believed fear gave them power because most people spent their lives avoiding it. But Aberforth grew up beside fear every day until it became woven into the structure of his life. When fear becomes familiar, intimidation loses much of its strength. Albus escaped much of this reality through Hogwarts. Not because he abandoned the family, though Aberforth sometimes accused him of exactly that, but because school offered temporary distance from the suffocating atmosphere inside the house. At Hogwarts, Albus became extraordinary. Professors admired him. Students followed him. His brilliance expanded constantly, like a fire finding more air. Meanwhile, Aberforth remained in Godric's Hollow longer and longer each year. His own education suffered badly because Ariana could not safely be left alone. Kendra needed help managing the household, especially as Ariana's condition worsened with adolescence. There were days when Aberforth spent more time calming magical disasters than practicing spells himself. The imbalance between the brothers slowly became impossible to ignore. One son was becoming famous. The other was becoming necessary. Necessity rarely receives admiration. By the age of 14, Aberforth understood practical magic far better than many trained adult wizards. He knew protective charms strong enough to contain shattered furniture during Ariana's episodes. He learned basic healing spells for burns and cuts because accidents happened constantly. He understood how unstable magic moved through space almost instinctively, after years spent predicting Ariana's outbursts seconds before they erupted. But none of this impressed anyone outside the family. The wizarding world valued visible achievement, awards, academic honors, ministry positions. Aberforth developed skills that existed entirely in private suffering. There were evenings when he sat awake beside Ariana's bed while rain struck the windows outside and the rest of the house slept uneasily. During calmer nights, Ariana sometimes spoke with surprising clarity. "Do you think I am bad?" she once asked quietly. Aberforth looked up from the chair beside her bed. "No," he answered immediately, "but things break around me." "That does not make you bad." She studied her hands for a long time after that. "I think people are frightened of me." Aberforth did not lie to her. Even at that age, he hated comforting falsehoods. "Some people are," he admitted. Ariana nodded slowly, almost as though she already knew. "But not you," she whispered. "No," he said, "not me." That simple exchange contained more truth than many wizarding philosophies combined. Ariana trusted Aberforth because he never tried to reshape reality into something prettier than it was. He acknowledged fear without surrendering to it. Voldemort later built his entire empire around emotional manipulation. He exploited denial, insecurity, prejudice, and ambition. Most people preferred comforting illusions over painful truth, and Voldemort understood this deeply. Aberforth did not. Years spent beside Ariana stripped away his patience for illusion entirely. He distrusted polished speeches. He distrusted charming personalities. He distrusted people who spoke constantly about destiny or greatness, while ignoring suffering directly in front of them. Most importantly, he learned to recognize danger beneath appearances. During Ariana's calmer periods, visitors occasionally came to the house. Ministry healers, concerned neighbors, curious acquaintances who pretended sympathy while quietly searching for gossip. Aberforth watched them carefully. Some feared Ariana immediately. Others performed exaggerated kindness that felt somehow worse. A few treated the family tragedy as fascinating. Aberforth hated those people most. One ministry healer spent nearly an hour discussing Ariana, as though she were a magical experiment rather than a person. He spoke enthusiastically about unstable magical repression, while Ariana sat silently in the corner, listening to every word. Aberforth finally ordered him out of the house. The healer left, offended, muttering about ungratefulness and lack of respect. Kendra scolded Aberforth afterward for his rudeness, but privately she looked relieved. These moments shaped him profoundly. He began dividing people into simple categories based not on intelligence or reputation, but on how they treated vulnerable individuals, those who protected, those who exploited, those who looked away. This moral instinct remained with him for the rest of his life. Albus increasingly moved in circles filled with brilliant minds and ambitious ideas. Aberforth moved through quieter realities, where character mattered more than intellect. Neither brother fully understood the other anymore. The distance between them widened slowly across years, rather than suddenly through argument. Albus saw possibilities everywhere. Aberforth saw consequences. Albus believed knowledge solved problems. Aberforth believed some people used knowledge to justify cruelty. Both brothers loved their family. Both suffered deeply because of Ariana, but suffering shaped them differently. For Albus, pain intensified his desire to achieve greatness, powerful enough to prevent future tragedy. For Aberforth, pain created suspicion toward anyone seeking greatness at all. This difference would eventually explode between them with catastrophic force. But even before Grindelwald entered their lives, the foundations of that conflict already existed inside the small, isolated house in Godric's Hollow. Late at night, after Ariana finally slept and Kendra exhausted herself into silence, Aberforth sometimes stepped outside alone into the cold village air. The stars above Godric's Hollow shone clearly over empty roads and dark cottages. Somewhere beyond those hills existed Hogwarts, ministries, brilliant futures, and powerful wizards discussing grand ideas. Inside the house behind him, another magical explosion might begin at any moment. Aberforth chose the house every time. Not because he lacked ambition entirely, but because responsibility had rooted itself too deeply inside him. He understood something many powerful wizards never learned. Power means very little if it cannot protect the people nearest to you. This belief made him seem small beside Albus Dumbledore. Years later, it would also make him one of the rare people Voldemort could neither manipulate nor truly understand. The first time Albus Dumbledore boarded the Hogwarts Express, the future seemed to open before him like a great illuminated hall. Professors quickly recognized his brilliance. Students admired him. Doors that remained closed to most young wizards appeared to swing open effortlessly in his presence. For Aberforth, watching his older brother leave Godric's Hollow felt less like triumph and more like abandonment. Not because Albus wished to abandon the family. Even years later, Aberforth understood that part clearly. Albus loved them all deeply, but love did not change reality. Once Hogwarts claimed Albus's attention, more and more responsibility settled onto the shoulders of those left behind, mostly onto Aberforth. The house grew quieter after Albus departed each September. Kendra moved through rooms with constant tension in her posture, listening always for signs of Ariana's instability. Letters arrived regularly from Hogwarts describing Albus's extraordinary achievements. Professors praised his talent in charms and transfiguration. Fellow students admired his intelligence. Rumors spread quickly that he might become one of the greatest wizards of the age. Kendra read those letters with pride shining through her exhaustion. Aberforth listened in silence. Part of him genuinely admired Albus. That was the difficult truth hidden beneath later bitterness. Even as a boy, Aberforth knew his brother possessed rare brilliance. When Albus explained magical theory, even complicated subjects suddenly seemed clear and logical. Problems that baffled adults appeared simple in his hands. But another part of Aberforth noticed something else. The further Albus moved toward greatness, the further he moved from ordinary life. At Hogwarts, Albus discussed magical innovation with professors, while Ariana screamed through another uncontrollable episode at home. He studied advanced transfiguration, while Kendra repaired shattered windows in the middle of the night. He earned awards and recognition, while Aberforth sat beside Ariana for hours trying to prevent her fear from triggering fresh destruction. The imbalance slowly became impossible to ignore. By the age of 13, Aberforth understood something few children should ever have to learn. Families do not collapse all at once. They erode gradually beneath pressure until every person inside them carries invisible exhaustion. Kendra aged quickly during those years. Her hair silvered early. Dark circles settled permanently beneath her eyes. She rarely left the house except for necessities, because Ariana's condition remained dangerously unstable and deeply secret. The wizarding world knew Percival Dumbledore attacked Muggles and vanished into Azkaban. Few understood why. Fewer still knew Ariana's condition had become the hidden center of the family's existence. Exposure meant disaster. If ministry officials discovered Ariana's instability fully, she might be taken away, studied, institutionalized, feared. Kendra would not allow it. So the Dumbledores withdrew further from society with every passing year. For Aberforth, isolation became normal. While other wizarding children formed friendships and dreamed about Hogwarts houses, he spent afternoons repairing magical damage around the cottage. He learned practical spells because necessity demanded them. His education became fragmented and incomplete compared to Albus's extraordinary academic life. Yet in some ways, Aberforth's understanding of magic became more intimate than most formal students ever achieved. He learned how fear altered magical energy. He learned how exhaustion weakened protective enchantments. He learned that unstable emotions could transform ordinary rooms into dangerous spaces within seconds. These lessons were not theoretical. Mistakes carried real consequences. Once, during a violent outburst, Ariana accidentally sent heavy furniture flying across the kitchen with enough force to crack stone walls. Aberforth barely managed to pull Kendra aside before impact shattered an entire cabinet behind them. Afterward, While Ariana cried herself into exhaustion upstairs, Kendra sat silently at the kitchen table, staring at splintered wood scattered across the floor. "We cannot continue like this forever," she whispered eventually. Aberforth did not answer because he already knew. That awareness shaped him deeply. Unlike many young wizards, he grew up understanding that power did not automatically create safety. Sometimes the most powerful magic caused the greatest suffering. This lesson stood in direct opposition to the worldview later embraced by Voldemort. Tom Riddle believed magical superiority justified dominance. He viewed power itself as proof of worth. Strength meant entitlement. Aberforth Dumbledore learned the opposite. He saw immense magical power destroy his family piece by piece. He watched Ariana's unstable abilities trap her inside fear and isolation. He watched brilliant magical minds fail repeatedly to help her. As a result, Aberforth developed deep suspicion toward the wizarding world's worship of greatness. The Ministry admired powerful wizards. Hogwarts celebrated exceptional talent. History remembered conquerors, inventors, and revolutionary figures. But none of those institutions cared very much about families quietly collapsing behind closed doors. This bitterness began early. During Albus's school holidays, the tension between the brothers slowly increased. At first, it appeared small enough to ignore. Albus returned from Hogwarts filled with stories about professors, magical discoveries, and intellectual debates. Aberforth listened politely, but struggled to connect those conversations to the exhausting reality inside the cottage. Sometimes Albus spoke excitedly about theories regarding magical structure or advanced spellcraft, while Ariana screamed upstairs because she had shattered another room in panic. The contrast became painful. Albus always helped when he came home. He never refused responsibility entirely. But even during holidays, part of him remained oriented toward larger ambitions beyond Godric's Hollow. Aberforth could feel it. Albus belonged to the wider wizarding world in a way Aberforth never would. That realization carried complicated emotions. Envy existed there, certainly, but also resentment toward the unfairness of circumstance itself. If Ariana had never been attacked, perhaps Aberforth's life would have unfolded differently. Perhaps he might have attended Hogwarts properly without interruption. Perhaps he might have discovered talents beyond practical survival and emotional endurance. Instead, responsibility rooted him permanently inside the damaged remains of the family home. Oddly, this burden strengthened him in ways almost no one recognized. Because while Albus learned prestige, Aberforth learned resilience. Resilience is quieter than brilliance. It rarely attracts admiration. But wars are often survived through resilience more than genius. As the years passed, Aberforth became increasingly difficult to intimidate, not because he lacked fear entirely, but because ordinary threats seemed insignificant beside what he already lived with daily. This distinction mattered enormously later when Voldemort rose to power. Most people feared Voldemort because he disrupted ordinary life. His followers brought death, torture, uncertainty, and terror into peaceful homes. Aberforth had already watched terror settle permanently inside his own home years earlier. That familiarity changed him. By 15, he had grown physically strong from constant labor around the cottage and emotionally guarded from years spent protecting Ariana. He trusted very few people outside the family. He disliked polished ministry officials. He distrusted healers who spoke academically about suffering while remaining emotionally distant from it. Most of all, he hated manipulation. This hatred emerged gradually through watching how different people responded to Ariana's condition. Some pitied her openly. Some feared her. Some became fascinated in deeply uncomfortable ways, asking questions that treated her pain like intellectual curiosity. Aberforth remembered every one of those conversations. One visiting healer described Ariana as an extraordinary magical case, while standing only a few feet away from her. Aberforth interrupted him immediately. "She can hear you," he said coldly. The healer looked embarrassed for perhaps 2 seconds before continuing his explanation anyway. That moment remained with Aberforth for years. It taught him that intelligence often failed to create compassion. Brilliant people sometimes became so fascinated by ideas that they forgot ordinary human decency entirely. Albus never forgot Ariana's humanity, but Aberforth increasingly feared that ambition itself could slowly erode empathy in subtle ways. This fear deepened whenever Albus spoke about the future. There were evenings during school holidays when Albus discussed magical innovation with almost breathless excitement. He spoke about transforming wizarding society, expanding magical knowledge, pushing boundaries beyond anything previous generations imagined possible. Aberforth listened uneasily, not because the ideas themselves sounded evil, but because he noticed how easily ambition could pull attention away from suffering directly nearby. Ariana needed help now. Kendra needed rest now. The cottage itself felt one magical disaster away from collapse. Yet the wider wizarding world constantly encouraged Albus to think bigger and further ahead. Aberforth became deeply skeptical of people who talked constantly about changing the world. Grand visions often required sacrifices made by others. He had already watched his family sacrificed repeatedly to circumstances beyond their control. Late at night, after Ariana finally slept and Kendra exhausted herself into silence upstairs, Aberforth sometimes sat alone near the kitchen fire, thinking about how different his life had become from what he once imagined. He rarely allowed himself self-pity for long. There was too much practical work waiting each morning. Animals still needed feeding. Protective wards required maintenance. Ariana needed watching constantly. But beneath his roughening exterior, loneliness slowly settled into place. Albus formed friendships at Hogwarts with extraordinary students and respected professors. Aberforth's world narrowed further every year. Isolation became habit. Silence became easier than explanation. Few people truly knew him anymore, and perhaps that was when the foundations of his later strength truly formed. Because isolation can weaken some people while hardening others, Aberforth learned to exist without admiration, without recognition, without comfort, without dreams of greatness. By the time adulthood approached, he had already abandoned the idea that life would reward goodness fairly. He had seen too much suffering for that illusion to survive. Yet strangely, this made him morally steadier than many more celebrated wizards. He no longer believed in perfection. He believed in responsibility. Protect the vulnerable. Endure hardship. Distrust those who seek power too eagerly. Remain standing when others collapse. Simple principles. Quiet principles. But they created exactly the kind of man Voldemort later struggled to understand. Because Voldemort built his movement around emotional weaknesses he believed existed inside everyone. Fear, vanity, ambition, desperation for importance. Aberforth possessed very little of those things anymore. Years spent inside the isolated house at Godric's Hollow stripped many illusions away from him long before Voldemort ever rose to power. By the time dark wizards began spreading fear across Britain, Aberforth Dumbledore had already spent most of his life carrying fear quietly inside himself. And people who become accustomed to carrying fear are often far more dangerous than they appear. The summer of 1899 arrived heavy with heat and quiet exhaustion. By then, the house in Godric's Hollow no longer resembled an ordinary family home. Protective enchantments layered the walls like invisible scars. Curtains remained drawn most days to prevent neighbors from noticing flashes of uncontrolled magic. Even the garden had grown wild and uneven, because there was rarely enough time or energy left to tend it properly. Inside the cottage, every member of the Dumbledore family carried a different form of grief. Kendra moved through the days with the fragile determination of someone surviving entirely through duty. Ariana drifted between moments of childlike calm and terrifying instability. Aberforth carried resentment he barely understood himself, and Albus Dumbledore had begun dreaming of escape. He had recently completed his extraordinary Hogwarts education, graduating with honors that professors spoke about almost reverently. Letters arrived from influential witches and wizards across Europe, offering opportunities few graduates could imagine. Some invited him into advanced magical research. Others suggested ministry careers or academic partnerships. Everyone seemed to agree on one thing: Albus Dumbledore was destined for greatness. But destiny felt suffocating inside the cottage at Godric's Hollow. Every morning, he woke not to applause or intellectual discovery, but to the reality of Ariana's condition and the crushing responsibility waiting around him. Brilliant futures meant very little while his sister remained unstable, and his mother slowly destroyed herself trying to hold the family together. Then, Gellert Grindelwald arrived in Godric's Hollow. Years later, many people would describe Grindelwald in terms almost mythical: handsome, charismatic, visionary, dangerous. But what mattered most was not his appearance or magical talent. It was the effect he had on people around him. Grindelwald made others feel as though they stood on the edge of history itself. He came to stay with his great-aunt, Bathilda Bagshot, after being expelled from Durmstrang for dangerous magical experimentation. Bathilda, already respected as a magical historian, viewed her nephew with affectionate optimism rather than fear. Like many brilliant adults, she mistook recklessness for genius. Albus met Grindelwald only days after his arrival. The connection between them was immediate and overwhelming. For the first time in his life, Albus encountered someone who matched him intellectually, while also encouraging his most ambitious instincts rather than tempering them. Their conversations stretched for hours deep into the night. They discussed magical theory, wizarding history, revolutionary ideas, and eventually, the Deathly Hallows themselves. Inside those discussions, something dangerous slowly formed. Not simply friendship, not merely admiration, but shared ambition powerful enough to distort morality. Aberforth noticed the change almost immediately. Albus became distracted at home, impatient during Ariana's episodes, absent-minded during conversations with Kendra. His attention increasingly pointed beyond the cottage walls toward larger dreams waiting elsewhere. Meanwhile, Grindelwald unsettled Aberforth from the beginning. He could not fully explain why at first. Grindelwald remained polite enough in conversation, intelligent certainly, charming when he wished to be. But Aberforth sensed something deeply wrong beneath the surface. Perhaps it was the way Grindelwald discussed people as though they were pieces on a game board. Perhaps it was the cold excitement in his voice whenever power entered conversation. Or perhaps Aberforth simply recognized selfishness, disguised as brilliance, because he had spent years watching suffering, while other people discussed grand ideas safely from a distance. One evening, Aberforth overheard part of a conversation between Grindelwald and Albus through the half-open kitchen window. The wizarding world hides because it lacks courage. Grindelwald was saying softly. We possess greater ability than Muggles in every meaningful way, yet we allow ourselves to live in secrecy and fear, Albus answered thoughtfully. The statute of secrecy exists for protection. For limitation, Grindelwald corrected. Wizards were not meant to hide forever. Aberforth listened silently from inside the darkened kitchen while rain tapped softly against the glass. There was excitement in Albus's voice he had not heard in years. Hope. That frightened Aberforth more than anger ever could, because hope makes intelligent people dangerous when attached to the wrong ideas. As the summer continued, Grindelwald became a constant presence in Albus's life. Together, they researched ancient magical lore, debated political philosophy, and built increasingly radical visions for the future. Their conversations eventually centered around one phrase that would later echo across Europe in terror: for the greater good. At first, the words sounded noble enough. Grindelwald argued that wizarding's superiority carried responsibility. Powerful magical people should guide the world openly, rather than hide from it. Sacrifices might become necessary, he admitted, but history always demanded sacrifice for progress. Albus, exhausted by years of feeling trapped inside family obligation, found the philosophy intoxicating. Aberforth found it horrifying. He understood immediately what Albus seemed unwilling to see. Ideas about greater good almost always required ordinary people to suffer, while ambitious men justified the suffering afterward. Ariana had already suffered enough for other people's ideas. One night, after Albus returned late from Bathilda Bagshot's house, Aberforth finally confronted him directly. You care more about him than your own family now, he said bluntly. Albus looked exhausted rather than angry. That is not true. You disappear every day while Mother struggles alone. I deserve some life beyond this house. The words settled heavily into silence between them, because part of Aberforth understood exactly what Albus meant. The cottage had become suffocating. Responsibility consumed everything inside it. But another part of him burned with fury at the implication hidden beneath the statement, as though Ariana herself had become a prison. She is your sister, Aberforth said quietly, and I know that better than anyone. No, Aberforth answered. You know theories better than anyone. The argument ended there outwardly, but something important had fractured beneath the surface. Albus increasingly viewed Aberforth as narrow-minded and stubborn. Aberforth increasingly viewed Albus as someone becoming dangerously detached from ordinary human reality, and Grindelwald widened that distance constantly. Unlike Aberforth, Grindelwald encouraged Albus to see himself as exceptional, beyond normal moral constraints. Great men should not waste their lives trapped by lesser responsibilities, he argued. History belonged to those willing to reshape it boldly. To Aberforth, the entire philosophy sounded disturbingly familiar. It resembled the same emotional cruelty he had witnessed from ministry officials and detached healers who spoke academically about Ariana while ignoring her humanity entirely. People who believed themselves superior often became capable of terrible things. Aberforth recognized this instinctively years before Voldemort rose to power, preaching blood superiority and magical dominance. That was another reason Voldemort later struggled to understand him. Aberforth possessed an unusually sensitive instinct for corruption, hidden beneath charm and intelligence. He identified danger emotionally, long before he could explain it logically. As the summer neared its end, tension inside the cottage became unbearable. Kendra's health worsened visibly under constant strain. Ariana's episodes grew more violent and unpredictable. Grindelwald and Albus spent increasing amounts of time planning futures, that barely included the realities of family responsibility at all. Then Kendra Dumbledore died. The magical explosion that killed her came during one of Ariana's uncontrolled outbursts. No one ever knew exactly what spell or force struck the fatal blow. By the time Albus and Aberforth reached the room, Kendra already lay motionless on the floor, while shattered magic crackled through the air around Ariana like dying lightning. Everything changed instantly. The funeral took place quietly beneath grey skies in Godric's Hollow Cemetery. Few people attended. The Dumbledore family had lived too long in isolation for large mourning crowds. Aberforth stood beside Ariana throughout the service, while Albus stared hollow-eyed at the grave. Grief settled over the family like winter frost. Yet even after Kendra's death, Grindelwald continued pressing Albus toward their plans. He viewed the tragedy as obstacle rather than warning. Responsibilities could be managed later, he insisted. Their greater purpose mattered more than remaining trapped forever inside one damaged household. Aberforth finally understood then exactly what kind of man Grindelwald truly was. A man willing to sacrifice vulnerable people for abstract ideals. The confrontation exploded only days later. Accounts differ regarding every detail afterward, but certain truths remain clear. Aberforth accused Albus directly of neglecting Ariana and abandoning his responsibilities. Grindelwald intervened. Tempers rose rapidly. Wands emerged. Then the duel began. 3 extraordinarily emotional young wizards stood inside the cramped cottage carrying years of grief, resentment, ambition, guilt, and fury between them. Magic erupted violently through the room. Spells shattered walls and furniture alike. Ariana screamed somewhere amid the chaos. Then suddenly, she fell silent. No one ever knew whose curse killed her. That uncertainty haunted Albus for the rest of his life. But for Aberforth, another realization mattered equally. Brilliant men discussing power and greatness had destroyed what remained of their family completely. After Ariana's death, Aberforth broke Albus's nose during the funeral argument that followed. The moment later became famous, partly because almost no one imagined anyone would dare physically attack Albus Dumbledore. But Aberforth had never feared powerful people properly. Not his brilliant brother, not Grindelwald, and eventually not Voldemort either, because fear requires belief in someone's superiority. Aberforth no longer believed powerful men were superior at all. He had watched them fail too many times. He had watched ambition consume compassion. He had watched brilliant minds rationalize terrible selfishness beneath beautiful language. Most importantly, he had learned that emotional honesty mattered more than charisma. Grindelwald frightened many people because he appeared visionary and unstoppable. Aberforth saw only a manipulative young man willing to sacrifice others for his own ideals. Years later, Voldemort would inspire terror through remarkably similar methods. Grand promises, superiority, destiny, fear disguised as inevitability. But Aberforth Dumbledore had already lived through one charismatic revolutionary, destroying his family from within. That experience changed him permanently. While the wizarding world later admired Albus for his legendary duel against Grindelwald, Aberforth remembered something quieter and more painful. Before Grindelwald became a dark wizard, feared across Europe, he had simply been another ambitious man, convincing brilliant people that ordinary love and responsibility were obstacles standing in the way of greatness. And Aberforth hated him for it, long before anyone else fully understood why. After Ariana's death, the Dumbledore family ceased to exist in any ordinary sense. The small cottage in Godric's Hollow remained standing, but the warmth that once filled it had vanished completely. Kendra was buried beside Ariana, beneath the quiet churchyard earth. Grindelwald fled the country within hours of the tragedy, abandoning both Albus and the wreckage left behind. And the two surviving brothers found themselves trapped together inside grief too large for either of them to explain properly. Aberforth blamed Albus for what happened. Part of him always would. Not because he believed Albus deliberately harmed Ariana, but because he believed ambition itself had poisoned his brother long before the duel began. Grindelwald merely revealed tendencies already growing inside him. Albus responded to suffering by reaching upward toward larger ideas, greater causes, and intellectual purpose. Aberforth responded by moving closer toward immediate responsibility. This difference became the defining divide between them. For years afterward, Albus carried guilt like a hidden wound beneath every achievement. He traveled, studied, taught, and eventually became one of the greatest wizards alive. Yet beneath the calm wisdom others admired, there remained the memory of that summer in Godric's Hollow. Aberforth carried something else entirely: distrust, not only toward Grindelwald, but toward the entire type of person Grindelwald represented. Brilliant men who spoke beautifully about the future. Powerful men convinced they understood what sacrifices history required. Charismatic men who viewed ordinary people as obstacles, followers, or tools. Aberforth recognized dangerous ambition, the way experienced sailors recognize approaching storms. He did not always explain his instincts elegantly, but they were rarely wrong. This was one of the great misunderstandings surrounding Aberforth Dumbledore throughout his life. Many people assumed he lacked sophistication because he disliked intellectual games and political maneuvering. In truth, he simply viewed such things with suspicion after seeing where they could lead. The wizarding world admired genius intensely. Aberforth admired kindness. The wizarding world respected magical power. Aberforth respected reliability. The wizarding world forgave dangerous men if they were brilliant enough. Aberforth almost never did. Years later, when Voldemort began gathering followers, these instincts became deeply important. Tom Riddle and Gellert Grindelwald differed in many ways. Grindelwald presented himself as revolutionary and visionary, speaking openly about reshaping the world for wizarding superiority. Voldemort preferred fear, secrecy, and domination through terror rather than persuasion. Yet beneath those differences, Aberforth sensed the same corruption inside both men, a belief that power justified control over others, a willingness to sacrifice ordinary lives for abstract goals, an inability to value human beings unless they possessed usefulness or strength. Most importantly, both men viewed emotional attachment as weakness. Aberforth understood this instinctively because he had spent his entire life beside vulnerable people. Ariana's suffering taught him that strength alone meant very little. Some of the kindest people he knew possessed almost no power at all. Meanwhile, some brilliant wizards caused devastation simply because they believed themselves important enough to decide the fate of others. This was why Aberforth never fully trusted institutions either. The Ministry of Magic claimed authority and order, yet failed repeatedly to protect ordinary families from suffering. Hogwarts celebrated greatness while overlooking lonely students and damaged children. Powerful magical communities discussed morality endlessly while hiding fear beneath polished speeches. Aberforth saw hypocrisy everywhere once he learned how to recognize it. That recognition made him emotionally difficult to manipulate. Most dark wizards succeed not merely through magical strength, but through psychological understanding. They discover what people desire and offer it back to them in distorted form. Voldemort promised fearful people safety through domination. He promised ambitious people influence and importance. He promised prejudiced people superiority. He promised bitter people revenge. Nearly every follower he gathered possessed some emotional weakness he could exploit. Aberforth Dumbledore presented a problem because he desired very little from the world anymore. He did not seek prestige. He did not care about social status. He distrusted authority naturally. And after years spent enduring grief, intimidation lost much of its effect on him. People who survive prolonged suffering often become strangely difficult to threaten. They already understand loss too intimately for fear alone to control them completely. This quality separated Aberforth sharply from many wizards Voldemort later manipulated with ease. During Middle Age, Aberforth settled permanently into the Hog's Head Inn near Hogwarts Village. Outsiders often misunderstood the choice. They saw only a filthy tavern filled with suspicious customers, sour smells, and rough conversation. Some assumed Aberforth deliberately wasted his life there out of bitterness toward Albus. The truth was more complicated. The Hog's Head suited Aberforth precisely because it existed far away from performance and illusion. Inside the inn, people revealed themselves honestly. Drunks complained openly. Criminals whispered nervous deals in corners. Travelers arrived exhausted and frightened rather than polished and impressive. Aberforth preferred environments where masks slipped naturally. Years spent observing desperate people sharpened his instincts further. He could often identify dangerous personalities within minutes of conversation. Vanity, cruelty, cowardice, hunger for power. These traits revealed themselves quickly once alcohol loosened restraint. Albus once remarked privately that Aberforth understood people far better than he admitted. The irony was painful. Albus understood minds brilliantly. He grasped magical theory, strategy, and philosophy at levels almost no one else could reach. Aberforth understood motives, and motives often matter more than intelligence during war. This difference became especially visible in how the brothers judged character. Albus repeatedly believed dangerous people could change if guided carefully enough. He trusted Severus Snape despite enormous risk. He once trusted Grindelwald. Even as a Hogwarts professor, he initially viewed Tom Riddle with curiosity rather than fear. Aberforth rarely made such mistakes, not because he lacked compassion, but because he judged people primarily by how they treated the vulnerable. Ariana remained central to this worldview long after her death. Whenever Aberforth encountered charming or ambitious individuals, part of him remembered Grindelwald standing inside the cottage, discussing the greater good while Ariana suffered upstairs unseen. That memory lingered behind every later judgment. If someone treated weakness with contempt, Aberforth distrusted them immediately. If someone valued power more than people, he noticed. If someone manipulated emotions for influence, he recognized the pattern instinctively. Voldemort embodied all those qualities completely. The Dark Lord viewed weakness almost as moral failure. He despised dependency, vulnerability, emotional attachment, and ordinary human limitation. He surrounded himself with followers who admired fear, because fear created hierarchy and control. Aberforth found such people deeply predictable. That was another thing Voldemort failed to understand about him. The Dark Lord believed fear itself granted power, because most people either surrendered to fear or worshipped those capable of inspiring it. Aberforth had spent too many years around unstable magic, grief, and death to romanticize fear in that way. Fear was simply another burden to carry, not a source of greatness, not proof of superiority. just another reality life forced upon people unfairly. Late some evenings, inside the Hog's Head, after customers departed and silence settled over the dark wooden rooms, Aberforth sometimes sat alone beside dim candlelight, remembering the summer Grindelwald entered their lives. Not the famous parts history later celebrated, not the legendary duel or revolutionary philosophy. He remembered smaller details instead. How quickly Albus stopped noticing exhaustion in Kendra's face. How Grindelwald dismissed Ariana as obstacle rather than person. How ambition slowly transformed compassion into inconvenience. These memories hardened Aberforth permanently against anyone who pursued power too eagerly afterward. Many people mistook this hardness for cynicism. In reality, it emerged from painful moral clarity. Because Aberforth learned something the wizarding world often forgot. Evil rarely arrives announcing itself honestly. More often, it arrives sounding intelligent, reasonable, and necessary. Grindelwald spoke about liberation. Voldemort spoke about order and purity. Both left destruction behind them. Aberforth never forgot that pattern. As the decades passed, he watched wizarding Britain drift gradually toward another catastrophe under Voldemort's rise. Fear spread quietly at first, through rumors and disappearances. Influential families aligned themselves carefully with growing darkness. Many ordinary witches and wizards convinced themselves the danger remained exaggerated because accepting reality felt too frightening. Aberforth recognized the signs immediately. Charismatic cruelty always begins by making itself appear inevitable. That inevitability was precisely what he rejected. Unlike many people, Aberforth never viewed powerful dark wizards as larger than life. He saw damaged men consumed by hunger for control, dangerous certainly, capable of enormous destruction, but still human beneath the spectacle. Voldemort demanded worship partly because he feared ordinariness more than death itself. Aberforth found that almost pathetic. Perhaps that was why Voldemort could never fully intimidate him psychologically. The Dark Lord understood opponents who sought glory or power because those desires mirrored his own mind. He understood ambition. He understood rivalry. But Aberforth Dumbledore did not operate according to those instincts. He protected rather than conquered, endured rather than dominated, observed rather than performed. And people shaped by quiet endurance are often far harder to break than people built around ambition, because ambition creates pressure points. Endurance creates roots. By the time Voldemort's shadow fully stretched across Britain, Aberforth had already spent decades becoming exactly the kind of man dark wizards struggle to control. A man who recognized corruption instinctively, a man unimpressed by power, and a man who had learned long ago that greatness without compassion eventually destroys everything around it. By the time Lord Voldemort first began gathering true power in Britain, Aberforth Dumbledore was already a man shaped by more private wars than most wizards would ever survive. He had buried his mother and sister before adulthood had fully settled over him. He had lost his father to Azkaban, lost his brother to reputation and greatness, and lost whatever peaceful version of himself might once have existed in the small village where the Dumbledore children first learned the sound of magic. So when whispers began moving through the wizarding world about a new dark wizard rising from the shadows, Aberforth did not react with surprise. He had heard such language before. Not the same names, not the same symbols, not the same followers in masks, gathering in secret rooms and old pureblood houses. But the shape of it was familiar. The promise of strength, the contempt for weakness, the belief that some people were born to rule and others were born to kneel. To many, Voldemort's rise seemed sudden at first. like a storm appearing without warning over a summer sky. But Aberforth understood that storms often gather long before anyone looks upward. In taverns, people spoke differently before wars became official. At first, it was only a careless sentence after too many drinks, a muttered complaint about Muggleborns getting too comfortable, a bitter remark about the ministry being weak, a laugh when someone mentioned that certain families knew how to keep the old traditions alive. Aberforth heard these things from behind the bar of the Hog's Head Inn. The Hog's Head stood in Hogsmeade, like a stubborn refusal to become respectable. Its windows were dirty, its floorboards creaked. The air inside carried the smells of stale ale, smoke, damp wool, and old secrets. Respectable visitors preferred the Three Broomsticks, where the light was warmer and the company more polished. But the Hog's Head attracted a different kind of person: lonely travelers, suspicious dealers, students seeking privacy, men and women who did not wish their conversations overheard by anyone polite enough to matter. And behind the bar stood Aberforth Dumbledore, listening more carefully than most customers realized. He did not present himself as a spy. He did not ask too many questions. He did not flatter important patrons or attempt to join their whispered discussions. He poured drinks, grunted when spoken to, and gave every impression of a man too sour and indifferent to notice much beyond the coins placed on the counter. This was one of the reasons people underestimated him. Aberforth understood the usefulness of being dismissed. Albus moved through the world surrounded by attention. His brilliance drew eyes even when he did not seek them. People watched him, measured him, feared him, admired him. Voldemort himself would one day consider Albus the only wizard he truly feared. Aberforth occupied the opposite position. He stood in plain sight and became nearly invisible. That invisibility made the Hog's Head valuable in ways no ministry office or grand meeting chamber could match. During the First Wizarding War, fear spread gradually through Britain until ordinary conversations became careful. People disappeared. Families whispered names only inside wards. Certain doors went unanswered after dark. The dark mark began to mean not merely death, but the collapse of safety itself. Voldemort understood public terror extremely well. Every murder served more than one purpose. It removed an enemy, certainly, but it also sent a message to everyone left alive. Obey. Stay silent. Doubt your neighbors. Fear what might happen if you resist. Aberforth watched that fear enter people, one face at a time. He saw it in the way customers lowered their voices when certain names were mentioned. He saw it in hands trembling around tankards. He saw it in witches who came into the inn alone and sat facing the door because they no longer trusted anyone behind them. Yet fear had a strange effect on Aberforth. It did not make him reckless, but neither did it paralyze him. He had already learned long ago that fear could not be avoided simply by obeying it. Ariana had taught him that. His family had hidden, protected, retreated, and endured, and still tragedy had come. The lesson he took from this was not despair, but stubbornness. If darkness came either way, a person might as well remain standing. The Order of the Phoenix formed under Albus's guidance during those years, gathering those willing to resist Voldemort openly or secretly. Aberforth's exact role in the First War remained quieter than many others. He was not remembered like James and Lily Potter. He was not celebrated like Alastair Moody or named in stories of famous duels. But the absence of fame does not mean the absence of courage. The Hog's Head became a place where information could pass unnoticed. A tavern with a bad reputation often hears better truths than a clean ministry corridor. people who would never speak freely before officials sometimes spoke after 3 drinks in a dark corner. Death Eater sympathizers boasted when they felt safe. Frightened witches confessed what they had heard. Travelers carried rumors from villages where strange disappearances had begun. Aberforth listened, not with Albus's grand strategic vision, perhaps, but with a practical sense of danger sharpened across decades. He knew when a rumor sounded empty and when it carried weight. He knew when a man was boasting and when he was accidentally revealing something important. He knew fear's texture in a voice. This kind of resistance rarely appears in history books because it does not create dramatic images. No glowing duel beneath lightning. No grand speech before battle. Only an old innkeeper wiping down a counter while silently remembering which customer mentioned a name, which stranger entered through the back door, which family had suddenly stopped coming into the village. But wars depend on such details. Voldemort's movement thrived through secrecy, intimidation, and networks of loyalty built on fear. The Death Eaters wore masks not only to hide identity, but to create the impression that darkness might be anywhere. A neighbor, a colleague, a school friend, a cousin at dinner. Aberforth's tavern pierced that illusion in small ways. Masks slipped there. People who believed themselves clever became careless. Those who thought the hog's head beneath notice underestimated the man behind the bar. To Voldemort, places like the Ministry mattered because they represented official power. Hogwarts mattered because Albus remained there. Pure blood manors mattered because influence gathered within them. A shabby inn, run by Albus Dumbledore's bitter brother, was easier to overlook. That was a mistake. Aberforth did not need to command armies to be dangerous. He only needed to endure in the right place, listening at the right time, refusing to be frightened into silence. There is reason to believe Voldemort understood the Dumbledore name as a problem long before his final defeat. Albus represented open opposition of the highest kind. His wisdom, magical ability, and moral authority made him the one wizard Voldemort hesitated to confront directly. Aberforth represented something less obvious, but still troublesome. He was too close to Albus to ignore completely, too independent to control easily, too isolated to pressure socially, and too bitter to be seduced by promises of greatness. This last point mattered more than most people would think. Voldemort was skilled at finding desire inside others and turning it into a leash. He could offer status to the insecure, revenge to the wounded, belonging to the lonely, and power to the ambitious. He gathered followers not only through fear, but through temptation. Aberforth's life had burned away many temptations long ago. What could Voldemort offer him? Recognition? Aberforth despised public admiration. Power. He had seen enough of what power did to families. Revenge. The people he blamed most deeply were already beyond punishment or too complicated to hate simply. Belonging. He had learned to live without it. Even fear for his own life would have limited effect on a man who had spent decades surrounded by grief. Aberforth was not eager to die, but death did not carry the same imaginative horror for him that it did for Voldemort. To Voldemort, death was the great enemy, the unacceptable defeat, the thing to conquer at any cost. To Aberforth, death was a familiar presence. It had taken his mother, his sister, his father in another form long before Azkaban finished him. Death had stood in the doorway of his life since youth, and though he hated it, he did not worship it with fear. That made him difficult to command. The first Wizarding War darkened everything it touched, but inside the Hog's Head, Aberforth maintained a stubborn, unpleasant, necessary kind of normality. Drinks were served, fires burned low, Customers came and went. Secrets passed beneath the roof beams, and the man behind the bar continued watching. He was not gentle in the way people wanted heroes to be gentle. He was not inspiring in the way Albus could be. He did not comfort frightened people with beautiful speeches about hope, but sometimes he allowed someone to sit in silence without asking questions. Sometimes he gave a traveler a room without recording too much. Sometimes he heard something dangerous and made sure the right person learned of it. In a war built on terror, such small acts mattered. Voldemort's power depended on the belief that everyone could eventually be frightened, tempted, or broken. Aberforth Dumbledore stood as quiet evidence against that belief, not because he was unbreakable in any grand, legendary sense, but because he had already broken in youth and continued living afterward. There is a particular kind of danger in people who survive their own ruin. They no longer believe survival requires innocence. They know life can become unbearable and still continue. They know grief can hollow a person out without making them obedient. Aberforth carried that knowledge behind the bar of the Hog's Head while the First War moved through Britain like a long shadow. And perhaps Voldemort, who understood fear better than love, sensed in the younger Dumbledore brother something he could not easily name. Not greatness, not glory, not even hope exactly, only endurance. And endurance, when joined to stubborn loyalty, can become one of the quietest forms of resistance in the world. The Hog's Head Inn had never been a place that invited comfort. It stood slightly apart from the warmer, brighter parts of Hogsmeade, as though the village itself had decided long ago to tolerate its existence rather than embrace it. The sign above the door creaked in bad weather. The windows were often clouded with grime. Inside, the wooden beams were dark with age and smoke, and the floor seemed to remember every muddy boot that had crossed it. Travellers who wanted laughter, butterbeer, and cheerful company went to the Three Broomsticks. Those who wanted privacy went to the Hog's Head. That distinction mattered more than most people realized. Every village has places where respectable life gathers openly, and places where hidden life moves quietly beneath the surface. The Hog's Head belonged to the second kind. It attracted people who did not want to be noticed. Witches with business they preferred not to explain. Wizards who kept their hoods low. Students sneaking beyond ordinary rules. Informants, smugglers, frightened families, and those who lived at the edges of magical society. For Aberforth Dumbledore, this suited him perfectly. He had never trusted polished surfaces. Clean rooms, official seals, and careful speeches often hid more than they revealed. In the Hog's Head, ugliness was at least honest. People entered knowing what kind of place it was. They did not pretend too much there. And because of that, they often revealed more than they intended. Aberforth's role behind the bar appeared simple. He served drinks. He grumbled at customers. He kept order when necessary. He gave no sign that he cared about the grand movement of wizarding history unfolding beyond his walls. But Aberforth was always watching. He noticed the changing atmosphere of Britain long before fear became fully public. He saw which customers began arriving in groups instead of alone. He saw old pureblood names whispered more often in corners. He heard jokes turn sharper, crueler, more dangerous. He noticed when certain people stopped speaking freely because someone new had entered the room. The Hog's Head became a kind of shadowed listening post. Not officially, not proudly, not in any way that could be written down and celebrated. But history often turns in rooms no one thinks important enough to record. It was inside the Hog's Head that Sybil Trelawney gave the prophecy that would shape the rest of Voldemort's life and Harry Potter's future. The meeting itself was not grand in outward appearance. Albus Dumbledore had come to interview Trelawney for a teaching position at Hogwarts. She seemed, at first, unlikely to impress him. Her reputation was theatrical, her manner peculiar, her predictions often vague enough to invite skepticism. Then something changed. A true prophecy emerged from her, spoken in a voice not entirely her own, naming the one with the power to vanquish the Dark Lord. The moment might have remained fully hidden if not for another listener nearby. Severus Snape, still serving Voldemort at the time, overheard part of the prophecy before being discovered and removed. He carried what he heard back to his master, believing it useful. That partial message became one of the most consequential fragments of information in the entire war. Voldemort acted upon it. He chose Harry Potter. He marked the child as his equal. He created the very enemy the prophecy had described. And all of this began in Aberforth's inn. This was the strange pattern of Aberforth's life. He appeared to stand outside history, yet history kept passing directly through his door. His family tragedy had been tied to Grindelwald, before Grindelwald became a terror across Europe. His tavern held the prophecy before Voldemort understood the trap waiting inside it. His dusty building, overlooked by respectable society, repeatedly became the place where hidden truth surfaced. There is deep irony in that. Voldemort loved grandeur. He built his identity around fear, mystery, and theatrical power. Even his chosen name was designed to separate him from ordinary humanity. He despised smallness. He despised weakness. He despised the unremarkable texture of daily life. Yet one of the most important turning points in his destiny occurred not in a palace, not in a battlefield, not in some ancient chamber of pureblood power, but in a shabby inn run by a man he would have considered beneath serious notice. That was precisely why the Hog's Head mattered. It was difficult to control because it did not operate like an institution. The ministry could be infiltrated through ambition and bureaucracy. Hogwarts could be threatened through governors, staff, students, and fear for children. Noble families could be pressured through reputation, inheritance, and blood loyalty. But the Hog's Head was different. It was low, rough, and stubbornly independent. It had little reputation worth destroying. It attracted people already accustomed to suspicion. It was not easily purified, polished, or absorbed into a cleaner version of magical society. Aberforth made it that way because he had become that way himself. He did not want the world's admiration. He did not want the approval of respectable witches and wizards. Their opinions had done nothing to save his family. Their laws had not healed Ariana. Their institutions had not prevented Grindelwald, nor would they prevent Voldemort without enormous sacrifice. So Aberforth remained where he was, inside the dim inn, present but difficult to categorize. This kind of invisibility can become power. Not the shining power of a duel where sparks fly and witnesses gasp. Not the formal power of office where laws are written and orders issued, but the quieter power of being underestimated. Customers spoke around Aberforth as though he were furniture. Some assumed he was too bitter to care. Others thought him too simple to understand complicated matters. Many saw only the rough exterior, the dirty glasses, the smell of goats, and the gruff replies. They forgot his surname, or perhaps they remembered it and believed the wrong thing about it. Being Albus Dumbledore's brother did not make Aberforth a lesser version of Albus. It made him something more unusual. He had spent his life close enough to greatness to see its dangers clearly, but far enough from admiration to avoid becoming dependent on it. Inside the Hog's Head, he built a life where observation mattered more than performance. During the years of Voldemort's rise, that life became increasingly valuable. Information moved strangely during wartime. Official channels became compromised. Letters could be watched. Conversations could be reported. Friends could become suspects. Ordinary trust weakened under the pressure of fear. But taverns remained places where people gathered. Even frightened people need rooms where they can drink, whisper, complain, and make mistakes. Aberforth heard those mistakes. A name spoken too loudly. A meeting mentioned carelessly. A rumor repeated by someone who did not understand its importance. He did not need to know every detail of Voldemort's operations to recognize danger passing through his rooms. Sometimes he only needed to remember enough and pass it quietly to the right ear. In this way, the Hog's Head became the opposite of Voldemort's world. Voldemort created fear by making people feel watched from above, judged by invisible power, threatened by forces they could not see. Aberforth resisted by watching from below, quietly, patiently, without spectacle. The inn also represented something Voldemort could never fully grasp. Human weakness gathered there openly, yet did not always become surrender. People came frightened, poor, drunk, angry, ashamed, or desperate. Voldemort would have viewed such weaknesses as proof of inferiority. Aberforth saw them as ordinary facts of being alive. He did not romanticize people. He knew they lied. He knew they betrayed. He knew they made foolish decisions for small reasons. Years behind the bar had taught him that humanity was rarely noble for very long without pressure. But he also knew that imperfect people could still resist. A frightened person could carry a message. A drunk could reveal truth. A bitter old man could shelter someone hunted. A dirty inn could become a hidden passage into hope. These were truths Voldemort repeatedly failed to understand, because he measured worth through power. He did not believe small acts mattered unless they served domination. He could not imagine that history might turn because someone overlooked chose not to cooperate fully with fear. Aberforth lived in the space Voldemort despised most, the ordinary, the practical, the stubbornly human. That made the Hog's Head difficult to conquer in any meaningful sense. Death Eaters could have entered it. They could have threatened its owner, broken furniture, searched rooms, questioned customers. But they could not easily destroy what the place represented, because its power did not come from walls. It came from refusal. The refusal to become respectable. The refusal to become frightened into usefulness. The refusal to admire power simply because it was dangerous. Night after night, while Hogwarts rose above Hogsmeade in its ancient dignity, and the Ministry pretended order could still be maintained, the Hog's Head kept its dim light burning near the edge of the village. Aberforth stood behind the bar, older now, rougher, more isolated than ever. His hands moved through familiar tasks, cleaning glasses, counting coins, feeding the fire, watching the door. To most people, it looked like a wasted life. To Voldemort, if he thought of it at all, it may have looked like nothing more than a shabby inn owned by a bitter man living in his brother's shadow. But that was the danger. Some forms of resistance survive precisely because they do not look important until the moment they become necessary. Lord Voldemort understood many things about human nature with frightening precision. He understood ambition. He understood envy. He understood the quiet desperation that made frightened people cling to power when they believed power might protect them. He knew how prejudice could be sharpened into loyalty and how humiliation could be transformed into hatred. These understandings allowed him to build followers from weakness. A young wizard who felt overlooked could be promised importance. An old pure-blood family frightened of losing status could be promised superiority. A bitter man could be promised revenge. A coward could be promised safety if he learned to fear the Dark Lord more than his own conscience. Voldemort built his movement carefully around these emotional fractures. His genius did not lie only in magic, but in recognizing what people secretly desired and feeding those desires until they outweighed morality itself. But there were certain kinds of people he never fully understood. People who wanted very little. People who accepted suffering rather than bargaining endlessly to avoid it. People who remained loyal not because they expected reward, but because loyalty itself mattered to them more than comfort. Aberforth Dumbledore belonged to that category. This made him difficult for Voldemort to predict. The Dark Lord viewed human beings almost mathematically. Every person possessed weaknesses waiting to be discovered. Fear, vanity, greed, loneliness, resentment. Push correctly upon those weaknesses, and eventually, resistance collapsed. Voldemort believed this because it was largely true. Again and again, throughout the wars, he watched powerful witches and wizards surrender principles for safety. Ministry officials bent rules out of fear. Influential families aligned themselves with darkness to protect status. Ordinary people convinced themselves silence was necessary for survival. Fear worked. It worked on most people. But Aberforth had already spent much of his life inside fear, long before Voldemort rose to power. Fear did not arrive in dramatic flashes for him. It settled slowly into the structure of daily existence after Oriana's attack. Fear of magical explosions inside the house. Fear of ministry discovery. Fear for Kendra's collapsing health. Fear of waking at night to screaming downstairs. Eventually, fear became familiar enough that it lost its ability to astonish him. This created something unusual. Most people obey terror because terror interrupts ordinary life. It threatens routines, relationships, and hopes for the future. But Aberforth's life had already been interrupted permanently decades earlier. By adulthood, he no longer expected safety in the same way other people did. Voldemort's methods therefore struck him differently. The murders horrified him, certainly. The cruelty disgusted him. But he never granted Voldemort the almost mythical psychological power many others unconsciously surrendered to. He saw the Dark Lord as another dangerous man consumed by the same sickness that had consumed Grindelwald before him. A hunger for control disguised as destiny. This comparison mattered deeply. Albus Dumbledore spent years studying Voldemort intellectually. He traced patterns in Tom Riddle's childhood, his obsession with immortality, his fascination with magical objects, and his emotional emptiness. Albus understood Voldemort brilliantly on the level of mind and strategy. Aberforth understood him more simply. He recognized the type immediately. A man who valued power above people. A man who viewed vulnerability with contempt. A man who believed himself too important to be limited by ordinary morality. Aberforth had met someone like that already in Godric's Hollow during the summer of 1899. There were differences between Grindelwald and Voldemort, of course. Grindelwald remained capable of charm in ways Voldemort eventually lost entirely. His rhetoric carried idealism rather than pure terror. Some historians later argued Grindelwald genuinely believed his revolution would improve the world, however twisted his methods became. Voldemort believed in nothing beyond domination and survival. Yet both men shared one fatal instinct. They treated ordinary human attachment as weakness. Friendship, family, loyalty, mercy. To them, such things mattered only insofar as they could be manipulated. Aberforth rejected that worldview completely because his entire life had been shaped by attachment rather than ambition. Everything important to him grew from love, carrying unbearable weight. His mother, exhausting herself to protect Ariana. His own years spent remaining beside his sister when easier lives existed elsewhere. Even his bitterness toward Albus came partly from love wounded beyond repair. This created a kind of moral stubbornness Voldemort struggled to comprehend. The Dark Lord understood sacrifice only as transaction. People gave something up in exchange for power, safety, or advantage. He could not imagine enduring suffering simply because another person needed protection. That was why Lily Potter's sacrifice confused him so deeply. It was why Neville Longbottom's resistance surprised him. And it was why people like Aberforth remained psychologically difficult for him to break. Aberforth did not think of himself as heroic. In truth, he distrusted heroism somewhat, because he had seen how grand visions could become excuses for cruelty. But there is a quiet form of courage that emerges when someone chooses responsibility repeatedly, despite exhaustion. Voldemort underestimated that kind of courage constantly. Inside the Hog's Head, Aberforth encountered many ordinary witches and wizards during the years of growing darkness. Some were brave openly, others were frightened almost beyond reason. Many simply wanted life to continue normally. Aberforth rarely judged them harshly for fear itself. Fear was natural. What mattered was what people became under its pressure. Some became cruel, some became obedient, some became silent, and a few remained decent in small, stubborn ways despite everything around them encouraging surrender. Aberforth trusted those people far more than he trusted celebrated heroes or influential officials. There was an old wizard who came into the Hog's Head once every few weeks during the First War, always sitting alone near the back wall beneath dim candlelight. He never spoke about politics directly, never raised his voice, never declared loyalty publicly. But one winter evening, Aberforth noticed the man quietly slipping money into the coat pocket of a frightened young Muggle-born student preparing to flee north with her family. The old wizard pretended not to notice afterward. The girl cried silently with relief. Aberforth remembered that moment far longer than he remembered speeches from famous ministry officials. Because resistance often survives through unnoticed acts rather than dramatic declarations. Voldemort missed this repeatedly because he viewed humanity through the lens of hierarchy and power. He noticed strong opponents, influential bloodlines, famous names. He paid less attention to ordinary loyalty, moving quietly beneath society's surface. This was one reason his wars eventually failed. People continued helping one another, even while terrified. A hidden room offered, a warning whispered, a stranger protected for one night, an innkeeper pretending not to notice who passed through his back door. These acts looked insignificant beside dark magic and public terror. Yet together, they formed networks stronger than Voldemort fully understood until too late. Aberforth himself embodied this principle almost perfectly. Outwardly, he looked unimpressive by the standards Voldemort admired. He did not possess Albus's legendary reputation. He did not seek followers. He dressed plainly, spoke roughly, and spent his days inside a dirty tavern, surrounded by goats and suspicious travelers. Nothing about him suggested greatness. That was precisely why he became dangerous. Powerful men often fail to recognize threats that do not resemble themselves. Voldemort respected magical talent because he worshipped power personally. He feared Albus because Albus represented greater magical mastery, joined to intelligence and moral authority. But Aberforth represented something stranger. Someone who could not easily be seduced. Someone too emotionally scarred to romanticize greatness. someone who had already lost enough that intimidation held limited value. This kind of person creates problems for tyrants, not because they always win duels or command armies, but because they remain morally independent. Voldemort depended upon emotional dependence constantly. Followers needed him, feared him, wanted his approval or protection. Even his enemies often organized themselves psychologically around his shadow. Aberforth refused that arrangement entirely. He acknowledged Voldemort's danger without granting him spiritual importance. There is enormous power in that refusal. Late during the First War, one frightened customer asked Aberforth quietly whether he believed Voldemort could truly be defeated. Aberforth cleaned a glass for several moments before answering. "Everything ends eventually," he said. The customer waited for something more inspiring. None came. That answer revealed much about him. Aberforth did not speak in grand prophecies or promises. He distrusted certainty too much after everything life had shown him. But beneath the rough simplicity of his reply existed something stronger than optimism: persistence. Darkness felt permanent while living inside it. Fear always tried to convince people that resistance was pointless, because power looked too large and suffering too endless. Aberforth rejected that logic instinctively, not because he believed goodness always triumphed cleanly, but because he had already lived through enough devastation to know survival itself could become resistance. This was another thing Voldemort failed to understand. The Dark Lord viewed broken people as weak people, but sometimes broken people become extremely difficult to control because they no longer expect life to reward them fairly. They stop bargaining with fear. They stop believing safety can always be purchased through obedience. Aberforth Dumbledore reached that point long before Voldemort ever learned his name properly. By the time the wars consumed Britain fully, the younger Dumbledore brother had become rooted in something the Dark Lord considered almost meaningless: ordinary human loyalty. Not glorious loyalty, not ideological fanaticism, simply the stubborn refusal to abandon vulnerable people because abandoning them would feel wrong. To Voldemort, such instincts appeared irrational and weak. To Aberforth, they were the only things that made power worth anything at all. For much of his life, Albus Dumbledore believed dangerous people could be understood well enough to be guided away from darkness. This belief came partly from compassion and partly from guilt. He had once loved Gellert Grindelwald, not merely admired him intellectually, but trusted him deeply enough to imagine reshaping the world together. Even after Grindelwald revealed the cruelty hidden beneath his beautiful ideas, Albus spent years avoiding direct confrontation with him. Some of that hesitation came from shame, some from lingering affection, some perhaps from the terrible possibility that part of Albus still recognized himself inside the young man he had once been. Aberforth never shared this weakness. He saw Grindelwald clearly, long before Albus allowed himself to. That difference between the brothers never truly disappeared. Throughout his life, Albus repeatedly became fascinated by brilliant and dangerous people, not because he approved of evil, but because he believed intelligence and pain could sometimes be redirected toward good. He searched constantly for hidden humanity beneath darkness. Sometimes this instinct saved lives. Sometimes it nearly destroyed them. Severus Snape was perhaps the greatest example. Nearly everyone else viewed Snape as cold, cruel, and untrustworthy. Albus saw guilt buried beneath bitterness and recognized the possibility of loyalty within it. That judgment ultimately proved correct, though at terrible cost. Tom Riddle presented another example. When the young orphan first arrived at Hogwarts, Albus immediately sensed something disturbing about him. Yet even then, he approached Tom with caution rather than outright condemnation. He watched carefully, hoping perhaps that guidance or belonging might prevent the boy's darker instincts from fully consuming him. Aberforth would have considered such hope dangerous. To him, certain traits mattered more than intelligence or hidden pain. Cruelty mattered. The treatment of vulnerable people mattered. The desire to control others mattered. Once someone crossed certain moral boundaries willingly, Aberforth distrusted them permanently. This made him seem harsher than Albus. In some ways, he was. But harshness and clarity are not always the same thing. Albus viewed human beings as complicated moral landscapes filled with contradiction and possibility. Aberforth viewed people more practically. He watched what they did when power rested in their hands. That told him most of what he needed to know. The contrast between the brothers became especially painful during the years surrounding Harry Potter. To the wizarding world, Albus Dumbledore represented wisdom itself by then. He defeated Grindelwald. He led Hogwarts. He opposed Voldemort openly, while others surrendered to fear. People trusted him almost instinctively, because he carried moral authority alongside extraordinary magical power. Aberforth trusted him far less, not because he doubted Albus's goodness entirely, but because he feared his brother's willingness to sacrifice emotionally for larger causes. That fear began during Ariana's life and never truly faded. To Aberforth, Albus possessed a dangerous ability to convince himself that painful choices served necessary purposes. Sometimes he was correct. Sometimes history proved him right eventually. But Aberforth never forgot how often ordinary people suffered beneath the weight of such decisions. This was why his anger toward Harry Potter's treatment ran so deep later. By the final years of the war, Aberforth saw patterns emerging that terrified him. Harry, still barely more than a child, carried responsibilities impossible for any young person to bear safely. Voldemort hunted him relentlessly. The wizarding world projected impossible hopes onto him. And through it all, Albus guided events from shadows and secrets, withholding enormous truths for reasons he believed necessary. To most people, this looked like wisdom. To Aberforth, it looked painfully familiar. Another young life being shaped around a larger war. Another vulnerable person expected to carry unbearable weight for the greater good. The phrase itself still carried poison for him decades after Grindelwald first spoke it in Godric's Hollow. Aberforth did not believe Albus wanted Harry harmed. He knew his brother loved the boy in his own guarded, complicated way, but love alone did not erase the possibility of manipulation. One of the bitterest truths Aberforth carried throughout life was this: good people could still cause terrible suffering if they believed the future demanded it strongly enough. That was what frightened him most about powerful idealists. The differences between the brothers appeared constantly in small moments. Albus surrounded himself with plans, strategies, and long-term thinking. He trusted patience and hidden preparation. He carried secrets because he believed revealing them too early could destroy larger hopes. Aberforth hated secrets. Secrets had poisoned the Dumbledore family from the beginning. Ariana hidden from the world, Kendra collapsing under silence, Albus concealing his ambitions with Grindelwald until catastrophe erupted. Aberforth preferred ugly truth over elegant deception almost every time. This made him seem blunt and unpleasant beside Albus's measured wisdom. Yet it also meant he often recognized emotional reality more quickly than others. When Harry, Ron, and Hermione arrived at the Hog's Head during the final year of the war, exhausted and hunted, Aberforth saw immediately what they truly were: children, not symbols, not chosen heroes, not strategic pieces in some vast magical conflict. 3 frightened young people carrying burdens far too large for them. His reaction shocked Harry, partly because it clashed so sharply with Albus's worldview. Aberforth urged them to stop fighting, hide and survive while they still could. "You're in far too deep to get out now," Harry argued desperately. Aberforth looked at him for a long time before answering. "You don't know how many men I've seen die because they thought there was no way back." Behind the bitterness in his voice lay decades of accumulated grief. He remembered Ariana. He remembered Grindelwald. He remembered the First War swallowing young lives, while older wizards discussed strategy and sacrifice. To Harry, retreat seemed cowardly. To Aberforth, survival itself possessed moral value, because too many dead people already filled his memory. Yet even inside that argument, something complicated emerged. Aberforth still helped them. He argued harshly. He criticized Albus openly. He exposed painful truths about the Dumbledore family Harry had never fully understood. But when danger arrived, he opened hidden passages and gave protection anyway. This was the deepest difference between the brothers. Albus inspired people through vision. Aberforth protected people through stubborn loyalty. Neither approach was entirely sufficient alone. Albus could inspire resistance across the wizarding world because people believed in him almost spiritually. His wisdom gave others courage larger than themselves. But such greatness often required emotional distance and terrible decisions. Aberforth remained closer to ordinary suffering. He saw immediate consequences more clearly than grand strategy. He measured morality not by historical outcomes, but by whether vulnerable people survived another day. This made him resistant to exactly the kind of thinking Voldemort depended upon. Voldemort believed emotional attachment weakened judgment. In many ways, he was correct. Love complicated strategy constantly. Fear for others created vulnerability. Compassion forced hesitation. But Voldemort misunderstood one crucial thing. Emotional attachment also creates forms of courage impossible to manufacture through fear alone. Aberforth embodied this principle perfectly. He did not fight because he believed himself destined for greatness. He fought because abandoning vulnerable people felt morally unbearable to him. That distinction mattered enormously. Voldemort could comprehend rivalry and ambition because those instincts mirrored his own soul. He understood why someone might seek power, glory, immortality, or vengeance. He struggled to understand people motivated primarily by loyalty. This confusion appears repeatedly throughout the wars. Lily Potter sacrificing herself for Harry. Dobby defying cruel masters out of love. Neville Longbottom enduring torture and loss while continuing to resist. And Aberforth Dumbledore remaining quietly loyal to people and places despite decades of grief and disappointment. To Voldemort, such behavior seemed irrational because it offered no obvious reward. To Aberforth, loyalty was not transaction. It was obligation freely accepted. Late in life, after Albus's death, Aberforth carried immense bitterness toward his brother, but the bitterness itself revealed something important. He expected more from Albus than from anyone else. He judged him harshly, precisely because he loved him deeply once. That emotional honesty separated Aberforth sharply from Voldemort's world. Death Eaters often admired power without morality. They followed strength because strength frightened or excited them. Loyalty inside Voldemort's ranks depended heavily upon fear. Aberforth's loyalty operated differently. It survived disappointment. It survived anger. It even survived betrayal to some extent. He could rage against Albus while still defending Hogwarts in his memory. He could criticize Harry while still protecting him. This complexity confused simpler moral systems built entirely around obedience or domination. The final irony was painful. The wizarding world celebrated Albus Dumbledore because his greatness was visible. His victories shaped history directly. His name inspired hope. Aberforth's greatness, if the word even fits him properly, remained hidden inside rough conversations, stubborn protection, and quiet refusal to abandon others. Yet Voldemort may have feared the younger Dumbledore brother in a subtler way, precisely because Aberforth represented something the Dark Lord could neither corrupt nor fully predict. Not brilliance, not magical superiority, simply a wounded man who understood suffering clearly enough to recognize the cost of power whenever someone reached for it too eagerly. And men like that are often far harder to deceive than legends themselves. By the time the Second Wizarding War began in earnest, the world around Hogwarts had changed into something colder and more uncertain than many students fully understood. Fear moved quietly through villages and homes like winter fog, settling across empty roads. Ministry officials disappeared from positions overnight. Newspapers shifted tone carefully, becoming cautious where they had once been bold. Conversations stopped when strangers entered rooms, and beneath all of it, Lord Voldemort's influence spread steadily outward. Yet hidden beneath Hogwarts itself, another network quietly endured. Not a grand army, not an organized rebellion filled with banners and speeches. Something smaller, harder to notice, more human. At the center of it stood Aberforth Dumbledore. By then, age had roughened him further. His beard had gone grey and uneven. Years behind the bar of the Hog's Head had bent his posture slightly and deepened the permanent weariness around his eyes. To most observers, he looked exactly like what he pretended to be, an irritable old innkeeper, but appearance often concealed truth where Aberforth was concerned. After Albus's death atop the astronomy tower, the balance of the wizarding world shifted catastrophically. Even those who disliked or distrusted Albus Dumbledore had unconsciously relied upon his existence for years. He represented resistance strong enough to stand visibly against Voldemort. Once he died, fear deepened everywhere. The Ministry fell soon afterward. Hogwarts changed under the control of Severus Snape and the Carrows, and throughout Britain, people began learning the dangerous habit of silence. Aberforth watched all of this from the Hog's Head. Some part of him had always expected darkness to return eventually. He understood too well that evil rarely disappears permanently after one defeat. Grindelwald fell, yet another dark wizard rose decades later. Fear changed names and symbols, but its structure remained familiar. What surprised him was not Voldemort's cruelty. It was how quickly ordinary institutions bent beneath pressure. The Ministry became compromised almost immediately once fear entered its highest levels. Laws changed, propaganda spread, suspicion replaced trust. Even Hogwarts, the ancient heart of magical Britain, transformed under occupation into something unrecognizable to many students. But hidden systems of resistance survived precisely because they did not resemble official power. That was where Aberforth became important. The enchanted mirror first connected him to Harry Potter, almost accidentally, through Albus's old network of secrets. Harry carried a shard of Sirius Black's mirror without fully understanding its significance for some time. During moments of desperation, fragments of communication passed through the glass. At first, Harry saw only flashes, a blue eye watching, a brief movement, the sense that someone unseen remained aware of his struggle. That eye belonged to Aberforth. The detail mattered deeply because it revealed something essential about him. Even after decades of bitterness toward Albus, he still watched over the people his brother had tried to protect. Not openly, not warmly, but faithfully. This was the shape of Aberforth's loyalty, quiet, hidden, and deeply stubborn. As danger intensified across Britain, the Hog's Head gradually transformed into more than a tavern. It became a crossing point, a place where frightened people might disappear briefly from Voldemort's sight, a place where messages passed carefully beneath ordinary conversation, a place where resistance survived not through glory, but through persistence. Most revolutions imagine themselves through dramatic images, famous speeches, burning banners, great victories. But real resistance often looks smaller. A hidden meal, a locked door opened after midnight, a wounded stranger allowed to rest beside the fire for one evening. Aberforth understood this instinctively because he had spent most of his life protecting vulnerable people quietly rather than inspiring crowds publicly. The hidden passage between the Hog's Head and Hogwarts reflected this perfectly. The Room of Requirement had always possessed mysterious qualities, changing itself according to need. During Voldemort's control of Hogwarts, it became sanctuary for students resisting the Carrows and the increasingly brutal atmosphere within the castle. Neville Longbottom helped lead that resistance from inside. But resistance requires supply lines, food, information, safe movement, hope. The passage connecting Hogwarts to the Hog's Head became one of the most important hidden routes in the entire war. Students escaped through it. Supplies moved through it. Messages traveled through darkness beneath stone, while Voldemort's forces controlled the visible world above. And at the entrance waited Aberforth Dumbledore. There is something deeply symbolic about that image. All his life, Aberforth existed at thresholds, between greatness and obscurity, between family loyalty and resentment, between isolation and protection. Now, in the final war against Voldemort, he literally guarded a hidden doorway between oppression and safety, not through destiny, not through prophecy, simply because he stayed where he was needed. The younger Dumbledore brother never sought importance, yet history kept placing responsibility into his hands precisely because he remained dependable when larger systems failed. Students trusted him because he did not speak to them like symbols. That distinction mattered enormously. Many adults during wartime looked at young people and saw causes, victories, futures, or sacrifices waiting to happen. Aberforth saw frightened children first. When students arrived hungry or exhausted through the tunnel, he fed them. Complained while doing it, perhaps, but fed them all the same. He did not romanticize their bravery, because he understood too clearly what war actually cost. Some nights, he likely remembered Ariana while watching terrified young faces emerge from the passage. Children trapped inside battles created by adults. Children expected to survive impossible circumstances. That memory haunted everything he did. Voldemort's world depended upon hierarchy and spectacle. The Dark Lord stood at the center like a black sun, pulling fear into orbit around himself. Death Eaters performed loyalty through violence and obedience. Public terror became demonstration of strength. Aberforth's resistance worked differently. Invisible, practical, human. He did not need followers chanting his name. He needed doors that remained open. He needed frightened people kept alive one more night. That made him difficult for Voldemort to defeat conceptually. The Dark Lord understood direct opposition. He understood enemies who challenged him openly because open conflict reinforced his sense of grandeur. But quiet networks of loyalty frustrated him constantly because they operated beneath the level of theatrical power. A hidden innkeeper mattered less to Voldemort than a famous aura or influential minister. Yet hidden innkeepers kept rebellions alive. During the final year before the Battle of Hogwarts, the castle itself became increasingly oppressive under Snape and the Carrows. Punishments turned cruel. Students disappeared into detention, carrying injuries. Fear settled into corridors once associated with learning and wonder. But the existence of hidden resistance mattered psychologically almost as much as practically. As long as secret passageways remained open, Voldemort's control remained incomplete. That incompleteness was dangerous. Tyranny relies heavily upon inevitability. People obey partly because they begin believing resistance no longer exists anywhere. Once hope disappears entirely, fear becomes easier to maintain. Aberforth helped prevent that collapse. Again, not through inspiring speeches, through continuity. The passage remained open. The Hogshead remained standing. Food still arrived. Messages still traveled. The world had not ended completely yet. This kind of endurance rarely receives songs afterward, because it lacks dramatic spectacle. But history often survives through people willing to maintain ordinary necessities, while larger figures fight visible battles. Aberforth became one of those people. There is deep irony in the fact that the younger Dumbledore brother, who distrusted grand causes for most of his life, ultimately became essential to preserving the resistance against Voldemort. But perhaps the irony only appears on the surface. Aberforth never opposed helping others. He opposed sacrificing people carelessly for abstract ideals. Once the war became unavoidable, once children and vulnerable people faced immediate danger, his path became morally simple. Protect whoever stands before you. That principle guided him more reliably than ideology ever could. It also made him frightening in a subtle way to someone like Voldemort, because Voldemort depended heavily upon understanding motivations. He manipulated ambition, fear, and desire expertly because those emotions created leverage. But Aberforth's motivations remained rooted in stubborn loyalty and accumulated grief rather than personal aspiration. What threat works against a man who already expects disappointment? What temptation controls someone uninterested in status? What fear dominates someone who has buried almost everyone he loved? Voldemort could kill such people, but controlling them proved much harder. Late during the war, as resistance inside Hogwarts intensified, Aberforth stood increasingly close to the center of events, despite spending most of his life avoiding attention. The irony would likely have amused him bitterly if he had time to reflect upon it. All those years in the shadows, all those years dismissed as merely Albus Dumbledore's unpleasant brother, and now frightened students, hunted fugitives, and hidden fighters depended upon the rough old man inside the shabby inn near the edge of the village. Perhaps that was always his true role, not the brilliant wizard history remembers, the keeper of doors, the protector of hidden passages, the man who remained standing quietly in the dark, while others searched desperately for somewhere safe to go. And sometimes, during the worst moments in human history, such people become more important than legends. After Albus Dumbledore died, darkness settled over Hogwarts in a way the castle had not known for centuries. The ancient corridors remained physically unchanged at first. Candles still floated above the Great Hall. Staircases still shifted slowly through the stone interior. The lake still reflected moonlight beneath the towers. Yet something inside the school had altered fundamentally. Fear now lived there openly. Students felt it in the silence between conversations. Professors felt it in the careful restraint entering every lesson. Even the ghosts drifting through the castle seemed quieter, as though the stone itself understood what had been lost atop the astronomy tower. For years, many people believed Hogwarts untouchable because Albus Dumbledore remained within its walls. His presence alone created protection stronger than enchantments. Even Voldemort hesitated to move openly against the school while Albus lived. Once he died, that protection fractured almost immediately. Severus Snape became headmaster under Voldemort's control, while the Carrows transformed discipline into cruelty. Punishments turned brutal. Fear became educational policy. Students learned quickly that obedience mattered more than learning now. And throughout all of it, Aberforth Dumbledore watched from the Hog's Head below the castle. The village of Hogsmeade changed during those months as well. Conversations shortened, doors closed earlier at night. People moved more carefully through streets once filled with laughter from students visiting on weekends. Voldemort's influence had spread so completely across Britain that even small villages carried the tension of occupation. Yet resistance survived quietly beneath the surface. Neville Longbottom, Luna Lovegood, Ginny Weasley, and others kept Dumbledore's army alive inside Hogwarts despite enormous danger. Students disappeared into hidden rooms after curfew. Secret messages passed between trusted hands. Punishments grew harsher because the spirit of rebellion refused to disappear entirely. And feeding that rebellion, protecting it, sustaining it from below, stood Aberforth. The younger Dumbledore brother had spent most of his life avoiding causes larger than immediate human need. But now the need stood directly before him every night. Children arrived frightened, injured, hungry, and hunted by adults serving Voldemort openly. Aberforth could not turn away from that. Whatever bitterness remained toward Albus, whatever anger still lingered from Godric's Hollow and Ariana's death, those emotions became secondary beside the practical reality of vulnerable people requiring protection. So the Hog's Head became sanctuary. Not an ideal sanctuary, not warm or comforting in any romantic sense. The inn still smelled of smoke and old wood and goats. Aberforth still spoke roughly and avoided unnecessary tenderness, but hidden beneath the roughness was reliability, and reliability becomes precious during terror. Students escaped through the passage from Hogwarts into the inn, carrying bruises, exhaustion, and fear, hidden beneath forced bravery. Some had been tortured by the Carrows. Some had watched friends vanish into punishment rooms. Others simply reached the edge of what they could endure inside the castle. Aberforth received them all. He fed them, found them places to sleep, watched the doors carefully while they rested. He did not ask for admiration while doing these things because admiration embarrassed him slightly, nor did he offer speeches about courage. He distrusted speeches too much after watching men like Grindelwald twist beautiful language into justification for suffering. Instead, he focused on practical survival. More bread needed baking. Another blanket found upstairs. Someone must stand watch near the door tonight. This was the shape of his resistance. The Carrows ruled Hogwarts through humiliation as much as fear. They wanted students to internalize helplessness slowly until obedience became instinctive. Public punishment mattered because it taught everyone watching that resistance led only to pain. Voldemort's regime operated similarly across Britain itself. Disappearances, trials without justice, families threatened quietly behind closed doors. The message remained constant everywhere. You are powerless. No one will help you. Resistance is foolish. Aberforth disrupted that message simply by continuing to help people. There is enormous psychological importance in hidden kindness during oppressive times. Tyranny survives partly by convincing ordinary people that compassion has become dangerous and therefore impossible. Once neighbors stop protecting one another, Fear expands rapidly into every empty space left behind. But the Hog's Head remained one of the places where compassion still functioned. A frightened student could arrive at midnight and find food waiting. A hunted fugitive could disappear into the tunnel beneath the inn. A wounded resistance member could rest beside the fire for one evening without betrayal. These things sound small beside battles and prophecies. Yet civilizations often survive because enough people continue performing small acts of loyalty after fear tells them to stop. Aberforth understood this more deeply than most. He had spent his entire life watching what happened when vulnerable people lost protection. Ariana's suffering shaped every instinct inside him. Long before Hogwarts fell under Voldemort's shadow, Aberforth learned that survival sometimes depends entirely upon whether one stubborn, exhausted person decides to remain beside you anyway. That lesson returned now through every frightened child emerging from the hidden passage. Some nights, after students fell asleep upstairs or slipped quietly back through the tunnel toward Hogwarts, Aberforth remained awake alone beside the dying fire. The inn settled around him with old familiar sounds. Wooden beams creaked softly in the wind. Glass clicked faintly somewhere behind the bar. Outside, the village remained dark beneath the distant outline of the castle. During such hours, memory likely returned heavily. Ariana, Kendra, Albus, all the years spent carrying grief without resolution. There is a particular loneliness attached to surviving longer than the people who shaped your life. Aberforth carried that loneliness constantly by old age. Most of those he loved were dead, transformed by time, or trapped behind painful distance. Yet despite everything, despite bitterness and disappointment and decades of isolation, he still chose to help others. That choice mattered enormously. Voldemort believed suffering naturally produced cruelty or submission. In many cases, he was correct. Pain often twists people inward until survival becomes their only remaining concern. Fear isolates, but sometimes suffering creates deeper empathy instead. Aberforth belonged to that second category, because he remembered too clearly what it felt like to be trapped inside a house collapsing beneath invisible pressure while the wider world remained distant and indifferent. He remembered watching Ariana treated as burden, danger, or embarrassment by people who failed to see her humanity fully. So when frightened students appeared at the Hog's Head, he saw them as human first. Not soldiers, not symbols, children. This distinguished him sharply from Voldemort's worldview. The Dark Lord viewed younger generations primarily as tools to shape or control. Hogwarts itself mattered strategically because it produced future magical society. Control the school, and eventually control the culture emerging from it. Aberforth cared less about shaping the future abstractly. He cared about whether terrified children survived the present. Again and again, throughout the wars, this difference became morally decisive. The hidden network beneath Hogwarts grew stronger because people like Aberforth sustained it quietly. Resistance requires more than bravery. It requires infrastructure, food, shelter, information, routes of escape. Adults willing to take risks for those younger than themselves. The younger Dumbledore brother became one of those adults, almost reluctantly, as though responsibility kept finding him no matter how fiercely he avoided greatness. Perhaps that was always true. Albus moved toward destiny willingly. Aberforth moved toward necessity because necessity stood directly in front of him demanding action, and necessity leaves little room for illusion. Late during the final year before the Battle of Hogwarts, the atmosphere inside Britain became almost unbearable. Voldemort controlled the ministry openly now. Muggleborns were hunted officially. Death Eaters moved with increasing confidence through magical society. Yet even then, hidden resistance survived. Inside forests, inside abandoned homes, inside secret rooms beneath castles, inside dirty taverns where old men kept doors open after midnight. This persistence frustrated Voldemort deeply because it violated his understanding of fear. He believed terror, applied long enough, eventually broke all meaningful opposition. But opposition rooted in ordinary human loyalty proved harder to destroy than expected. Aberforth represented that truth completely. He did not possess Albus's dazzling public authority. No one looked at him and saw a legendary savior. Yet the final resistance against Voldemort depended heavily upon people exactly like him. People willing to continue helping despite exhaustion. People unimpressed by power. People too stubborn to surrender vulnerable lives completely into darkness. In the end, that may have been what Voldemort feared most about Aberforth Dumbledore. Not magical strength, not prophecy. Simply the terrible persistence of a man who had already survived grief, disappointment, and ruin long ago, and therefore could not easily be frightened into abandoning others now. Because tyrants understand how to conquer people who still believe safety can be preserved through obedience. But people who have already lost almost everything often become much harder to rule. When Harry Potter, Ron Weasley, and Hermione Granger finally arrived at the Hog's Head during the final months of the war, they carried exhaustion so deep it seemed to follow them like shadow. Their clothes were worn from weeks spent hiding and traveling. Hunger sharpened their faces. Fear lingered constantly behind their eyes, even when they tried to appear determined. They had already lost too much by then. Friends, safety, certainty. And somewhere beneath all of it, each of them carried the growing realization that Albus Dumbledore had left behind more questions than answers. Aberforth saw this immediately, not because he possessed Albus's remarkable insight into human nature, but because weariness recognizes itself easily in others. The meeting inside the Hog's Head became one of the most revealing moments in the entire history of the Dumbledore family. Not because spells were cast or battles fought, but because old wounds finally surfaced openly. For years, the wizarding world had treated Albus Dumbledore almost as a figure beyond ordinary criticism. His wisdom became legend. His victories became history. Even people who disagreed with him often spoke his name carefully, as though moral greatness itself surrounded him like light. Aberforth never fully accepted that version of his brother, and now, standing before Harry Potter, he finally spoke aloud the anger he had carried for decades. The room itself remained dim and cramped while the conversation unfolded. Firelight moved softly across old wooden walls stained dark by years of smoke. Somewhere downstairs, the inn creaked quietly in the wind. Outside, Hogsmeade existed under Voldemort's shadow, while Hogwarts loomed above the village like a castle occupied by ghosts. Inside that small room, Harry expected guidance. Instead, he found disillusionment. Aberforth listened while Harry explained pieces of Dumbledore's plans and Voldemort's growing danger. The older man's face remained hard throughout much of it. Not cruel exactly, simply exhausted beyond patience for idealism. Then Harry spoke Albus's name with trust still lingering inside his voice. Something in Aberforth tightened immediately. "You never knew him," he said. The words carried far more weight than simple criticism. Behind them existed decades of grief, resentment, admiration, disappointment, and unresolved love. Aberforth knew Albus more intimately than almost anyone alive ever had. He knew the brilliant student admired by professors, He knew the young man intoxicated by Grindelwald's dreams. He knew the brother who failed Ariana. He knew the legendary headmaster who carried secrets inside secrets until even those closest to him no longer understood where honesty ended. And now he watched Harry following the same path, trusting Albus completely while walking towards suffering. To Harry, Dumbledore represented hope and wisdom. To Aberforth, he represented something far more dangerous. A good man capable of sacrificing people for causes he believed necessary. This distinction mattered enormously. Dark wizards are easy to recognize eventually. Their cruelty becomes visible. Their hunger for power reveals itself through violence and fear. Voldemort inspired terror precisely because his evil stopped pretending to be anything else. Albus Dumbledore frightened Aberforth differently, because Albus genuinely loved people, and still people suffered around him. That contradiction haunted the younger Dumbledore brother for most of his life. When Aberforth finally spoke about Ariana during the conversation, the emotional atmosphere changed completely. He described caring for her after the attack, feeding her, calming her, protecting her while Albus dreamed of changing the world beside Grindelwald. Harry listened in stunned silence. Much of the wizarding world viewed Albus almost symbolically by then. Few people considered the damaged family history beneath the legend. Fewer still imagined the depth of pain still carried by the rough old innkeeper living in his shadow. But pain filled the room now. Not dramatic pain, not theatrical grief, something quieter and older, the kind that settles into a person permanently after enough years. She was gentle, Aberforth said softly of Ariana. The softness in his voice mattered because it appeared so rarely. Most people only knew Aberforth through rough replies and guarded expressions. But when speaking about Ariana, another version of him surfaced briefly. The boy who remained beside his sister while the world narrowed around them. Then came the line that revealed everything about how Aberforth viewed Albus's treatment of Harry. "I've been an idiot," he muttered bitterly, "thinking he cared about you." The statement cut deeply, because part of Harry already feared it might contain truth. Aberforth believed Albus had raised Harry towards sacrifice from the beginning, not out of cruelty, but out of strategic necessity. To the younger Dumbledore brother, the pattern looked horrifyingly familiar. Another vulnerable young person carrying impossible responsibility because older men believed history demanded it. This was exactly the kind of thinking Aberforth had hated since Grindelwald first entered their lives in Godric's Hollow. The greater good. Even decades later, he distrusted any cause requiring children to suffer for future victory. Harry resisted this interpretation fiercely. He defended Albus instinctively, because Dumbledore's guidance shaped much of his life and identity. Without that trust, enormous parts of Harry's understanding would collapse. But Aberforth forced him to confront painful ambiguity. What if wisdom and manipulation sometimes looked similar? What if good intentions still produced terrible harm? What if love itself became dangerous when mixed with grand plans? These questions lingered heavily between them. Yet despite everything, despite the anger and bitterness pouring from him, Aberforth still helped Harry. This was perhaps the most important detail of all, because Aberforth's worldview differed sharply from both Voldemort's and Albus's in crucial ways. Voldemort valued domination. Albus valued long-term moral strategy. Aberforth valued immediate protection. So while he argued against Harry's mission and begged him to flee while escape remained possible, he still opened the hidden passage into Hogwarts afterward. He still gave shelter, still chose loyalty over abandonment. The contradiction only appears strange if one misunderstands him. Aberforth did not believe wars justified sacrificing children carelessly, but once Harry stood before him, hunted and exhausted, refusing help became morally impossible. This reveals something essential about the younger Dumbledore brother. His morality operated through proximity. Protect the person directly in front of you. Feed the hungry traveler. Hide the frightened student. Open the door. Keep watch through the night. He distrusted abstract heroism, partly because abstract heroism often forgets individual suffering. But concrete acts of loyalty remained sacred to him. Voldemort never understood this kind of morality properly because it resisted simplification. The Dark Lord divided people through hierarchy and usefulness, strong or weak, pure or impure, loyal or enemy. Aberforth belonged to a category Voldemort struggled to comprehend. A man deeply wounded by the failures of others, bitter toward leadership and destiny alike, yet still incapable of abandoning vulnerable people when they needed him. Such people create enormous problems for tyrants. They are difficult to recruit because they distrust authority naturally, difficult to frighten because grief already reshaped them, and difficult to predict because they continue helping others, even after losing faith in grand causes entirely. Harry eventually realized something profound during the argument with Aberforth. The younger Dumbledore brother was not simply cynical. He was tired. There is an important difference. Cynicism assumes goodness never existed. Aberforth believed goodness existed because he had seen it in Ariana, in Kendra's exhausted devotion, even in Albus himself before ambition and tragedy complicated everything. What exhausted him was watching goodness repeatedly fail to protect people from suffering. This exhaustion shaped every harsh word he spoke. Yet even in his bitterness, he remained morally active. That distinction separated him sharply from despair. A truly defeated person closes the door completely. Aberforth kept opening it, again and again, to students, to fugitives, and now to Harry Potter himself, despite all his fears about where Albus's plans had led. Perhaps this was why Voldemort could never fully account for people like him. The Dark Lord understood devotion built upon worship or fear. Death Eaters followed because they sought power, protection, or belonging within his hierarchy. Even enemies often organized themselves around prophecy, destiny, and symbolic hope. Aberforth operated outside those structures almost entirely. He no longer trusted greatness enough to worship it, yet he still believed vulnerable people deserved protection. That belief survived everything. It survived Ariana's death. It survived decades of bitterness toward Albus. It survived war after war. And now, in the darkest days of Voldemort's rule, it guided his actions more reliably than ideology ever could. By the end of the conversation, Harry understood something deeply uncomfortable about the Dumbledore family. Albus and Aberforth represented two different responses to suffering. Albus transformed pain into vision and long strategy. He tried to guide history itself toward better outcomes, even when doing so demanded secrecy and sacrifice. Aberforth transformed pain into protective instinct. He focused on immediate human survival because he had watched too many people destroyed by beautiful plans already. Neither brother was entirely right, neither entirely wrong, but Voldemort feared the combination of those qualities more than he realized. Albus provided inspiration. Aberforth provided endurance. And endurance, especially when rooted in love stripped of illusion, becomes extraordinarily difficult to defeat. The night of the Battle of Hogwarts began not with triumph, but with movement through darkness. Word spread quietly first. Harry Potter had returned to the castle. Voldemort's forces were gathering. Students whispered through corridors, while professors exchanged grave looks beneath floating candlelight. Outside, the mountains surrounding Hogwarts stood black beneath a cold sky, as though the world itself waited in uneasy silence. Inside the Hog's Head, Aberforth Dumbledore listened while the final shape of war approached. He had spent most of his life standing at the edges of great events. Others became legends while he remained behind doors, behind counters, behind hidden passages. Yet now, history moved directly toward him once again, as it always seemed to do despite his efforts to avoid it. The passage between the inn and Hogwarts remained open. Students moved through it urgently. Members of the Order appeared carrying news and weapons. Fear traveled beside them all. But so did something else now. Decision. There comes a moment in every war when uncertainty ends and survival no longer depends upon hiding. The Battle of Hogwarts marked that moment for Britain. Voldemort intended to crush the final visible center of resistance completely. Hogwarts would either remain standing as symbol of defiance or become proof that no sanctuary remained anywhere. Aberforth understood this immediately, and despite everything inside him that distrusted heroism, despite every memory warning him about the cost of grand causes, he chose to stand beside the defenders openly at last. That choice mattered because it revealed the final truth about him. He never avoided battle out of cowardice. He avoided it because he understood too clearly what battle destroyed. Many people misunderstood Aberforth's roughness throughout his life. They mistook caution for weakness and bitterness for indifference. But surviving prolonged grief often creates a quieter relationship with violence. Those who have watched families collapse rarely rush eagerly toward conflict again. Yet when protection truly became necessary, Aberforth did not hesitate. The defenders gathering inside Hogwarts that night formed a strange collection of people. Professors, students, parents, aurors, former members of Dumbledore's army, house elves moving through kitchens below, ghosts drifting through ancient walls, while fear and courage mixed together inside the castle air. And among them walked the younger Dumbledore brother. Not Albus, the legendary wizard, Aberforth, the old innkeeper from the village below. There is something deeply moving about that image, because it strips away illusion completely. Aberforth did not arrive as prophecy or symbol. No one looked toward him expecting salvation. He came because vulnerable people remained inside the castle, and because Voldemort's army intended to destroy them. That was enough. Throughout the night, Hogwarts transformed from school into fortress. Desks became barricades. Statues awakened beneath Professor McGonagall's command. Protective enchantments spread across ancient stone towers, while defenders prepared for siege. Aberforth moved through these preparations with the same practical steadiness that defined his entire life. Not theatrical courage, not speeches, action. The final war against Voldemort gathered many different kinds of bravery together in one place. Some fighters possessed dazzling magical skill. Others carried strategic intelligence or fierce idealism. Aberforth represented another category entirely. Endurance hardened into loyalty. By then, he had already survived almost every form of personal loss imaginable. The deaths of family members, decades of loneliness, disappointment in the people he loved most deeply. Years spent watching darkness return repeatedly despite sacrifice after sacrifice. And still, he came to defend the castle. That persistence itself carried extraordinary moral weight. Voldemort built his understanding of humanity around corruption and fear. Deep inside, he believed people eventually surrendered when enough pain pressed against them. Loyalty would fracture. Hope would collapse. survival instinct would outweigh conscience. Often he was correct, yet the Battle of Hogwarts revealed all the places where his understanding failed. Parents arrived to fight beside children. Students refused evacuation. Teachers stood against impossible odds, knowing death likely waited. And Aberforth Dumbledore, who had spent much of his life distrusting greatness itself, entered the battle anyway, because ordinary people needed protecting. This was precisely the kind of courage Voldemort could never inspire among his own followers. Death Eaters obeyed through fear, ambition, and hierarchy. Their loyalty depended heavily upon Voldemort's power appearing inevitable. Once cracks formed in that image, panic spread rapidly among them. The defenders of Hogwarts operated differently. Many were terrified. Many doubted survival entirely. Yet they remained. Not because victory was guaranteed, but because abandoning one another felt morally impossible. Aberforth understood that instinct perfectly. In some ways, the battle brought his entire life full circle. As a boy, he protected Ariana inside a collapsing house, while unstable magic shattered walls around him. Now, decades later, he defended another group of vulnerable young people, while war tore through the ancient corridors of Hogwarts. The scale changed. The instinct remained identical. There is reason to believe Aberforth fought fiercely during the battle itself, despite his age. He was no longer young, but magical ability does not disappear simply because a person avoids fame. Years of hardship had hardened him physically and emotionally alike. More importantly, Aberforth fought without illusion. He did not romanticize war. People who romanticize battle often break quickly, once blood and terror become real. Aberforth entered conflict already understanding its ugliness. He expected suffering, expected fear, expected death. That expectation made him steadier than many younger fighters. At one point during the battle, the castle itself seemed alive with resistance. Giants moved outside the walls. Spells lit the darkness in flashes of green and gold. Screams echoed through corridors, while defenders carried the wounded toward temporary safety. The boundary between childhood and adulthood vanished entirely for many students that night. And through all of it, Aberforth remained present. No prophecy named him. No crowd celebrated him. Yet history repeatedly depends upon such people. The quiet defenders, the overlooked protectors. Those who remain after idealism burns away, carrying responsibility anyway. This may have been what truly separated him from Voldemort. The Dark Lord viewed power as identity. His entire sense of self depended upon superiority over others. Control became proof of existence itself. Without domination, he believed life meaningless. Aberforth's identity formed around something opposite: responsibility. He did not need worshippers or titles to understand who he was. Meaning came through protection rather than conquest. That difference appears almost philosophical, but during war, it becomes practical very quickly. One side fights primarily to dominate. The other fights because human beings behind them require defending. Those motivations create profoundly different kinds of endurance. As the battle intensified toward dawn, losses mounted terribly on both sides. Fred Weasley died. Remus Lupin and Tonks fell. Students who had once worried about exams now carried bodies through smoke-filled corridors. Aberforth witnessed all of this while continuing forward. Perhaps somewhere inside him, old memories rose again. Ariana dead after violent magic consumed the cottage. Kendra buried beneath grey skies. Albus carrying guilt silently through decades. The Dumbledore family knew too much about what war took from people. Yet despite that knowledge, despite every painful lesson life had taught him about the cost of conflict, Aberforth still stood against Voldemort openly in the end, because refusing to fight would have meant abandoning others to terror entirely, and that was one thing he could never do. The battle also revealed how incomplete Voldemort's understanding of fear truly was. He believed terror naturally isolated people, yet Hogwarts became strongest precisely when people united despite terror, instead of because fear disappeared. Aberforth contributed to that unity in his own rough, imperfect way, not through inspiration, through presence. A frightened student seeing the old innkeeper fighting beside professors and auras alike learned something important instantly. Resistance still existed. Adults had not abandoned them completely. The world had not surrendered entirely into darkness yet. Sometimes the mere existence of stubborn resistance changes the emotional shape of war. By dawn, Voldemort's forces had begun fracturing beneath pressures they did not fully understand. House elves joined the fight. Centaurs entered the battle. Defenders kept returning even after terrible losses. And somewhere amid the chaos moved Aberforth Dumbledore, the forgotten brother who spent his entire life in shadows only to emerge at the final hour when protection mattered most. History rarely notices such people immediately. Legends prefer brighter figures: the chosen hero, the brilliant leader, the dark conqueror. These personalities dominate memory because they seem larger than ordinary life. Aberforth never seemed larger than ordinary life. That was his strength. He represented the stubborn human loyalty Voldemort dismissed for too long, the kind that survives disappointment, grief, exhaustion, and fear without needing glory in return. And in the final battle for Hogwarts, that kind of loyalty proved stronger than terror itself. Lord Voldemort understood Albus Dumbledore better than most people realized. Not completely, perhaps. No one ever understood Albus entirely, not even those who loved him most deeply. But Voldemort recognized certain qualities in the elder Dumbledore because they reflected things he valued himself: exceptional intelligence, extraordinary magical power, influence strong enough to shape history. Voldemort respected power instinctively, even when he hated the person wielding it. That was why Albus became the one wizard he openly avoided confronting for many years. The Dark Lord understood danger when it appeared in recognizable form. Albus Dumbledore represented a rival mind joined to moral authority and magical mastery. Aberforth represented something stranger, something harder for Voldemort to measure. To understand this fully, one must look at the three Dumbledore siblings together, because each embodied a different response to suffering. Albus transformed suffering into wisdom and control. After Ariana's death and Grindelwald's betrayal, he spent the rest of his life attempting to guide events carefully enough to prevent future catastrophe. Knowledge became his shield against chaos. Strategy became his language. He carried guilt privately while projecting calm certainty publicly. Ariana embodied suffering itself, innocence damaged beyond repair by cruelty she never deserved. Her life became the silent wound beneath everything the Dumbledore family later became. And Aberforth embodied endurance, not glorious endurance, not triumphant resilience celebrated in stories. Something quieter, the ability to continue living after grief hollowed the world out. This difference mattered enormously because Voldemort's understanding of humanity depended heavily upon visible ambition and fear. He noticed those reaching upward toward greatness or shrinking downward beneath terror. But people who simply endured without seeking recognition confused his worldview. Aberforth never tried to become important. That made him difficult to predict Throughout his rise to power, Voldemort categorized people instinctively. Powerful opponents received caution, useful followers received rewards, frightened populations received intimidation. The entire structure of his rule depended upon understanding what drove human behavior. Yet the younger Dumbledore brother existed outside many of those patterns. He did not seek prestige. He distrusted institutions. He cared little for reputation, and most importantly, he valued human attachment more than power itself. To Voldemort, this appeared weak. To Aberforth, it was the only thing preventing the world from collapsing entirely into cruelty. The tragedy of the Dumbledore family shaped both brothers profoundly, but in opposite directions. Albus became more careful, more secretive, more strategic. After Grindelwald and Ariana, he feared his own capacity for ambition deeply. That fear partly explains why he refused positions of political authority later, despite enormous public pressure. He understood too well what happened when brilliant men convinced themselves they knew what sacrifices history required. Aberforth learned another lesson entirely. He stopped trusting greatness itself. This distinction explains why Voldemort understood Albus more naturally than Aberforth. The Dark Lord recognized intellectual ambition because ambition ruled his own life completely. He understood why someone might seek mastery, influence, or historical significance. Even Albus's restraint made sense within Voldemort's framework because restraint still revolved around power consciously withheld. But Aberforth's worldview operated differently. He did not define life through achievement. He defined it through responsibility. This seems simple on the surface, yet simplicity often hides enormous philosophical depth. Aberforth judged people primarily by how they treated the vulnerable standing nearest to them. Grand ideas mattered less than ordinary acts of protection. Did you feed the frightened child? Did you betray your neighbor? Did you remain beside someone after suffering made them difficult to love? These questions guided him more than ideology or destiny ever could. Voldemort almost never asked such questions. That was why he repeatedly underestimated people motivated by love stripped of ambition. Lily Potter, Neville Longbottom, Dobby, and eventually Harry himself. Again and again, the Dark Lord dismissed emotional loyalty as weakness because he interpreted all human behavior through domination and self-interest. Aberforth contradicted that interpretation simply by existing. The younger Dumbledore brother spent much of his life disappointed in people. He distrusted charm because Grindelwald once used charm to poison his family. He distrusted institutions because the Ministry and wider magical society failed Ariana completely. He even distrusted Albus at times because he feared his brother's brilliance allowed dangerous compromises. Yet despite all that distrust, he continued helping people. That was the crucial point Voldemort could never fully understand. Cynicism often produces selfishness. Bitterness usually narrows compassion over time. But Aberforth's suffering produced the opposite effect. It stripped away illusions while leaving loyalty intact. Such people become extremely dangerous to tyrants, not because they are fearless in any dramatic sense. Aberforth understood fear intimately, but fear no longer controlled his morality completely. Too much grief already lived inside him for intimidation alone to reshape his values easily. There is another important reason Voldemort struggled to understand the younger Dumbledore brother. Aberforth represented ordinary humanity more honestly than Albus ever could. Albus became mythologized during his lifetime. Students admired him. Newspapers praised him. Even enemies spoke about him with caution, approaching reverence. He stood slightly apart from ordinary life, because greatness isolated him naturally. Aberforth remained rooted in ordinary realities. He worked, cooked, fed travelers, listened to frightened people, buried family members, argued, grieved, aged. He existed inside the rough texture of human life without becoming symbolic. Voldemort despised ordinary humanity because it reminded him of weakness, dependence, and mortality. He tried constantly to rise above human limitation through power and fear. Even his chosen name represented rejection of his origins. Tom Riddle wanted to cease being ordinary entirely. Aberforth accepted ordinariness fully. This made him morally stronger in ways Voldemort failed to recognize. People who accept human limitation often develop greater compassion because they stop worshipping perfection. Aberforth knew people disappointed one another. He knew grief reshaped personality. He knew fear existed inside everyone, yet he still believed responsibility mattered. Voldemort's worldview allowed no such balance. To him, weakness deserved contempt. Vulnerability invited exploitation. Mortality itself became enemy. That philosophy created immense magical power, while simultaneously blinding him to certain forms of resistance. The Battle of Hogwarts revealed this blindness completely. Voldemort expected fear to dominate eventually, because fear had dominated so many others before. Yet ordinary witches and wizards kept resisting beyond rational expectation. Parents fought beside children. Teachers defended students. House elves charged into battle, carrying kitchen knives because loyalty outweighed terror. And Aberforth Dumbledore stood among them all, not as prophecy, not as chosen hero, simply as a tired old man refusing to abandon vulnerable people. That kind of resistance deeply unsettled Voldemort's understanding of power. The Dark Lord built his identity around superiority. He believed greatness separated him fundamentally from ordinary humanity. Therefore, ordinary humanity should eventually submit. But the younger Dumbledore brother represented the exact opposite principle. Human beings remain strongest when connected to one another, through loyalty rather than hierarchy. Aberforth learned this beside Ariana, long before Voldemort rose to prominence. Protection mattered more than prestige. Compassion mattered more than brilliance. Remaining beside suffering people mattered more than controlling history. These lessons made him appear unimpressive to many observers, yet they also made him strangely immune to corruption. What could Voldemort offer someone who no longer desired greatness? What temptation works against a man who distrusts power naturally? What fear controls someone already carrying decades of grief? The Dark Lord could kill such a person, perhaps. Torture him, certainly. But true domination required leverage. Aberforth possessed remarkably little leverage left to exploit. This may explain why Voldemort focused his attention far more heavily upon Albus throughout the wars. Albus fit the Dark Lord's psychological framework cleanly. Powerful rival, strategic opponent, moral obstacle. Aberforth remained more difficult to categorize. A bitter innkeeper, a hidden protector, a grieving brother, a stubborn defender. None of these identities resembled the forms of power Voldemort respected instinctively. Yet beneath them existed exactly the kind of moral endurance tyrannies struggle hardest to extinguish. In the end, the Dumbledore brothers represented two forms of resistance working together despite all their differences. Albus inspired people toward courage larger than themselves. He carried vision powerful enough to unite fragmented resistance against darkness. Aberforth sustained people practically. He kept doors open, passages hidden, and frightened souls alive long enough for hope to survive. Voldemort understood the first form better than the second. He knew how to fight legends. He never fully understood how difficult it becomes to defeat ordinary loyalty once enough wounded people decide they would rather suffer than surrender completely. And perhaps that was the final secret hidden inside the younger Dumbledore brother. Aberforth did not defeat Voldemort through magical superiority. He defeated him simply by remaining human in a world increasingly shaped by fear, power, and the temptation to abandon compassion for survival. To Voldemort, that looked weak. In truth, it was one of the strongest things anyone could become. When the war finally ended and the smoke above Hogwarts began to fade into the pale light of morning, the wizarding world searched immediately for heroes. That instinct was natural. People emerging from terror often need clear figures to anchor memory around, names large enough to stand against fear, stories capable of transforming grief into meaning. So history gathered itself quickly around Harry Potter, Albus Dumbledore, Severus Snape, and the great visible moments that shaped Voldemort's defeat. But quieter people remained beneath those stories. People who survived rather than triumphed. People who carried the war instead of defining it. Aberforth Dumbledore belonged to them completely. In the years after Voldemort's fall, the younger Dumbledore brother returned once more to the Hogshead Inn. There was no great ceremony attached to this. No ministry award shining beneath enchanted lights. No public speeches celebrating his role in protecting Hogwarts and sustaining resistance. That suited him perfectly. He had spent most of his life avoiding admiration because admiration made him uncomfortable. People who become symbols often stop being seen clearly. Albus understood this perhaps better than anyone. Greatness isolates. It transforms living human beings into ideas others project upon. Aberforth remained stubbornly human instead. The inn survived the war, much as it had survived everything else. The same worn floorboards creaked beneath heavy boots. Smoke still clung to the beams. Travelers still arrived carrying exhaustion and secrets. Outside, Hogsmeade slowly returned to ordinary life, while Hogwarts repaired its shattered walls above the village. And behind the bar stood the old innkeeper, who had helped keep resistance alive. There is something fitting about that ending. Not dramatic closure, not transformation into legend, simply continuation. Because endurance had always defined Aberforth more than glory ever could. Looking back across his life, one sees a man repeatedly placed beside catastrophe, without ever allowing catastrophe to fully consume his humanity. As a boy, he watched his sister destroyed by cruelty. As a young man, he witnessed ambition poison his family from within. As an adult, he survived 2 dark wizards rising to power across Europe and Britain alike. And through all of it, he remained emotionally recognizable. Angry sometimes, bitter often, lonely certainly, but still capable of loyalty, still capable of protection, still capable of opening the door when frightened people arrived needing shelter. That matters enormously. Many stories about war focus naturally on transformation. Heroes becoming stronger, villains falling into darkness, great destinies unfolding through suffering. But there is another kind of survival, less dramatic, and perhaps more difficult. Remaining morally human after grief teaches you how cruel the world can become. Aberforth achieved that kind of survival. Not perfectly. He was not gentle in the way fairy tales prefer their wise old men to be gentle. He snapped at customers, distrusted people quickly, carried resentment far longer than was healthy. Some wounds inside him never healed properly at all. But perfection was never his role. He represented something more believable and therefore more important. a person damaged deeply by life who still refuses to abandon others completely. Voldemort never understood people like that because his worldview depended upon suffering, eventually reducing human beings into selfishness or submission. The Dark Lord believed fear stripped morality away until only survival instinct remained. And sometimes he was right. Wars do reveal terrible things about humanity: cowardice, cruelty, opportunism, the willingness to betray neighbors for safety. Aberforth witnessed all of these things throughout both wizarding wars. Years behind the bar of the Hogshead showed him humanity at its least polished. He saw frightened people compromise themselves, saw ambition twist into collaboration, saw weakness become betrayal. Yet he also saw something else: people continuing to help one another despite exhaustion and terror, small loyalties surviving beneath enormous pressure. That was the truth Voldemort failed to account for fully. The wizarding world did not survive because everyone became brave heroes. Most people remained frightened throughout the wars. Resistance survived because enough ordinary individuals chose, again and again, not to surrender completely. A teacher hiding students, a parent refusing betrayal, an innkeeper keeping a secret passage open beneath his tavern. These acts looked insignificant beside dark magic and prophecy. Yet together they formed the real foundation of resistance. Aberforth understood this instinctively because he never romanticized greatness. He had already seen too clearly what happened when brilliant men convinced themselves history mattered more than immediate human suffering. That lesson began with Grindelwald. It continued with Voldemort, and it shaped every decision Aberforth made afterward. The tragedy of the Dumbledore family therefore carried meaning far beyond personal grief. The three siblings became different responses to suffering itself. Albus sought wisdom powerful enough to guide the world away from catastrophe. Ariana represented innocence destroyed by cruelty, and Aberforth carried the burden of endurance after hope had already been wounded too many times. Of the three, Voldemort perhaps understood Aberforth least of all. He could comprehend Albus, because Albus moved within recognizable structures of power and influence. Rivalry made sense to Voldemort. Greatness made sense. Strategic manipulation made sense. But the younger Dumbledore brother resisted through quieter instincts entirely. He valued protection over victory, loyalty over ambition, responsibility over destiny. These values appeared weak through Voldemort's eyes, because the Dark Lord measured worth through domination and fear. Yet in the end, it was precisely such ordinary loyalties that prevented total collapse during the darkest years of the war. There is also something important in the fact that Aberforth never became consumed by hatred, despite everything he lost. He had reasons enough. Muggle cruelty destroyed Ariana's life. Grindelwald helped destroy his family. Voldemort brought terror across Britain. Even Albus, the brother he loved most deeply, disappointed him repeatedly. Another person might have transformed such pain into bitterness toward the entire world. Voldemort himself emerged from childhood suffering, convinced vulnerability deserved punishment rather than compassion. Aberforth chose differently, not consciously perhaps, not through grand moral revelation, simply through repeated practical acts of loyalty. Feed the frightened traveler, protect the hunted student, open the hidden door. Sometimes moral greatness appears not through dramatic transformation, but through refusing to let grief extinguish basic human decency entirely. That was Aberforth's achievement. Late in life, he likely remained lonely. Some forms of grief never leave completely. Ariana's memory stayed with him always. So did the terrible summer of 1899. So did all the years spent watching darkness return again and again despite sacrifice. Yet loneliness did not make him cruel. This separated him fundamentally from Voldemort. The Dark Lord feared isolation so deeply that he tried to conquer death itself. He viewed dependence upon others as humiliation. Emotional attachment terrified him because attachment creates vulnerability. Aberforth accepted vulnerability instead. He accepted that loving people often ends painfully. Accepted that protection sometimes fails. Accepted that grief becomes part of living rather than enemy to defeat. This acceptance made him stronger than Voldemort in ways magic could never measure. Because people who accept suffering without worshipping it become extraordinarily difficult to corrupt. They stop searching for perfect safety, stop believing power alone can solve the deepest human wounds, stop sacrificing ordinary kindness in pursuit of greatness. By the end of his life, Aberforth Dumbledore remained what he had always been beneath everything else, a protector, not a flawless protector, not a legendary one, simply a man who stayed beside vulnerable people when easier choices existed elsewhere. And perhaps that is why Voldemort feared him. In the quiet, unspoken way tyrants fear certain ordinary individuals, not because Aberforth possessed greater magical power, not because prophecy marked him specially, but because he represented the kind of human loyalty that cannot easily be manipulated once it survives enough suffering. The Dark Lord understood how to conquer ambition. He understood how to exploit fear. He even understood how to tempt goodness into compromise. But he never fully understood people who continued choosing responsibility after illusion, glory, and hope itself had already been stripped away. People like Aberforth Dumbledore, the forgotten brother standing behind the bar while history passed through his doors, the wounded man who distrusted greatness yet still defended others, the quiet soul who endured grief without surrendering completely to darkness. And in the end, endurance itself became a form of courage Voldemort could never truly defeat. And so, dear listener, the candles inside Hogwarts burn low at last, while the mountains beyond the castle fade quietly into darkness. The Great War has passed into memory now, leaving behind ruined halls, whispered names, and countless lives forever changed by fear and sacrifice. Yet among those memories remains the figure of Aberforth Dumbledore, standing quietly behind the worn counter of the Hog's Head, much as he always had. He was never the chosen hero of prophecy, never the celebrated genius his brother became, and never the kind of man history pauses to admire for very long. But perhaps the world survives because of people exactly like him, people who remain after grief, people who keep doors open while darkness gathers outside, people who continue protecting others even after disappointment has worn away every illusion of greatness. As the night deepens and the last lights flicker softly across the grounds of Hogwarts, let your thoughts drift gently towards silence. Somewhere below the castle, hidden beneath old stone and shadowed streets, the forgotten Dumbledore brother still keeps watch beside the fire, while the world slowly grows quiet around him once more.